If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
Woods people, campers, hikers, etc. What is the scariest being or paranormal thing you've ever encountered in the deep woods or forests?
A couple of years back, at around 10 p.m., we had to go to our nearby farm to catch some horses that had escaped the fence. It was about a 2-mile trek through the woods to find them on another person's property. We finally got them to follow us back, and about midway, we started to smell something foul. I mean, it was wet, musky, and ducking strong. It was so overpowering that whatever it was definitely had to be something large in size. It was pretty scary because you can't see shit around you in deep woods at midnight, and it could have been a bear or God knows what else. I came to the conclusion it must have been a bear or dead animal, but some of the others insist it was Bigfoot. Ha. Grandpa? When I was younger, I was camping alone on my grandparents' land. I had planned to only stay a few nights, but after this, I left after one night. I was lying in my tent watching a show, about to go to bed when my phone all of a sudden died. I thought it was weird, but I thought maybe I wasn't paying attention to my battery, so I got out of my tent to go pee in the woods when I heard Josh from my recently deceased grandpa, so I threw my head around, and all I saw was this odd-looking deer about 300 yards away. Its body was extremely bony, and its eyes appeared to be distorted. I heard it again. Josh, but this time it didn't sound right. It made my blood run cold. It sounded like there was something stuck in its throat, and as I was staring at the thing, it started running after me, so I just started running in the opposite direction. When I remembered my grandfather had a shotgun in the shed ahead of me, I ran as fast as I could, but I could hear it catching up to me, yelling, "Josh, come here," in this low demonic voice. I just kept running towards the shed, and as I made it to the shed, I whipped open the door and found the shotgun, and I looked towards this thing and saw that it had almost caught up, so I started shooting at it. The thing fell to the ground, and all it said to me was in the demonic voice of my grandpa, "Josh, why?" I ran towards my tent to grab my phone and charger to call the police, and I plugged my phone in and ran towards the thing with a shotgun to make sure the thing didn't get away, and by the time I got back, the thing was gone. I lay in my tent with the shotgun that night, not getting any sleep, afraid that thing would come back. I never stayed there by myself again. Strange encounters in the woods. Hi, I'd like to start this out by saying that I am generally pretty skeptical about cryptids and the like, but I've recently had some experiences that I can't seem to explain. I've been an avid outdoorsman my entire life and spent countless hours in and around the woods, and this just has me stumped. This all took place in the mountains of western Montana over a 2-week time span. I was out having a campfire in a relatively secluded location with one of my friends when we noticed a random light from off in the woods. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but we noticed it moving around a bit, so we just chalked it up to a late-night hiker with a headlamp, but considering our location and the time of night, we didn't feel comfortable staying around, so we left. A couple of days later, I returned to the same spot alone and didn't see any lights at first, but after about an hour, they showed up again, in roughly the same direction, but this time there were 3 lights. The weird thing was, they all moved in sync, bobbing up and down and getting closer and farther away, all in unison. I decided to walk towards them to see if it might just be a sign reflecting light that I hadn't noticed, but as I approached, they seemed to be getting further away, maintaining roughly 300 yards of distance between me and them, so I turned around and left the area. A few days after that, I returned to the same place, this time at around 2:30 a.m., but I couldn't shake this feeling of paranoia that had overcome me, seemingly from the minute I showed up. At about 3:45, I heard a single noise that sounded like a whistle, just a single note, nothing crazy, but it sounded far off and deep into the woods, so I dismissed it as just a bird or some other small critter. But about 20 minutes later, I heard more whistling, this time a genuine tune that lasted about 15 seconds and sounded no more than 50 yards away. I said duck that and bolted to my car and left. I haven't been back since. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, as there has been a camper murdered in the area not too long beforehand, but this has been my creepiest experience in the woods since as long as I can remember. What do you all think? Is there anything in the area that could explain these encounters? Anything helps. I was with a few friends, about 8 people, late one night. We had just finished swimming at a quarry in southern Indiana. Well, needless to say, we all got bored after it hit nightfall and all decided to go somewhere haunted/creepy. My girlfriend and I had just gotten some paranormal equipment the past Christmas, and luckily, I had it in the car already. We first hit up Tunnelton's big tunnel but decided to go somewhere else due to the fact that it isn't that scary when you have a big group. We heard about a cemetery near Story, Indiana, and decided to go there. After a bit of driving down gravel roads for like a few miles, we finally found it. Deep in the middle of the woods, my headlights illuminated the Elkinsville Cemetery sign on the side of what once was a gravel road and is now a dirt path. We hop out of the car, making sure to be as respectful to the graves as possible. We weave to the very back of the cemetery. We sit there doing Estes method sessions, but we were not having any luck, even with the EMF reader, no activity at all. After a bit, we started finding peace in the silence. Cemeteries didn't really creep us out, but we loved the aesthetic of it. I started to stray away from the group because I thought I heard something in the woods, and I wanted to get a clearer sound without interrupting conversation. Then, I heard it. What sounded to be laughter coming from the woods sounded like a pack of hyenas. I went back to the group and asked them to listen to assure I'm not insane, but just then, I realized that the laughter not only didn't sound like a pack anymore but was also closer. I shined my flashlight everywhere, the tree line, the shelter behind us, and the tree and bush in the middle of the cemetery. I was looking for answers. We all jumped up and ran to the car. I had never had any issues starting the car ever since I purchased it a few years ago, but suddenly, it didn't want to turn over. Eventually it would start, and my headlights shone right onto the tree with a bush in the middle of the cemetery. Right there in the middle of the bush was a pair of eyes looking straight at us. I then see whatever it was take off on all fours towards the tree line behind us. I then whipped the car around to not lose track of it, but to our horror, what appeared to be an animal with fur crawling on all fours not even a second ago was now walking on its back legs and no fur into the woods. I was too in shock to move until my girlfriend grabbed me and shouted "drive" at me. Which I proceeded to floor it out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched the whole way out of the woods. To this day, I haven't been able to find any animal that would be able to do that in southern Indiana. I live on a mountaintop in Nipa. I've experienced some things around here that definitely enter the realm of paranormal, but it's to be expected on old land that is in places untouched or barely touched by modern man. There are a few things I've experienced in my area. I call them the old ones. Definitely not human and not a bother to humans. I drive up a mountain around 4 a.m. to take my girlfriend to work in a small city on the other side. The top of the mountain is barely touched outside of the road that runs up and across it and a small farm and pasture. My girlfriend and I have both seen the old one that, in my opinion, cares for the mountain. When we first moved here and started traveling that way, she saw something that looked like a deer but was way too big and had antlers that no PA whitetail should have, unless she actually saw the third point buck, and a lack of skin and fur. I saw something similar that I wouldn't have even noticed if it hadn't stood up and walked on two legs halfway across the road. Our blind spot sensors on our vehicle also will go off randomly after we pass a natural spring on the mountain sometimes. The thing that convinced me that it is a natural protector, outside of my own gut feelings, is the fact that in the last 3 years we have never seen a deer run across the road and know a lot of people who notice the same. Anyone from Nipa can tell you too that our whitetails are particularly suicidal lol, so that definitely checks the strange box. The mountain I live on also has something that comes and goes through the village we live in as well. I leave cake and liquor offerings to it on my property and get good vibes from it. San Felipe Road in San Jose. Possibly Skinwalker? Has anyone ever seen anything like this? I went to San Felipe today at around 3. It was around 4 a.m. but not yet 4 a.m. when we exited San Felipe. As we were going down San Felipe, the road was very foggy. Everything was fine, but as we were leaving San Felipe, I and the driver saw a translucent, squarish aspiration with waves next to the 3. I was also in the front seat. We both really couldn't describe what we saw. But the people in the back seat saw a furry creature with claws hanging on a tree. It was a gray/blackish creature, fat from what was described. The creature was also seen by multiple people before, but no one could ever give a clear description of it since they had never seen anything like it, but it looked humanoid. From other times they saw it walk on 4 legs and it's fat/thick but definitely not bigger than an adult human. So when we tried to go back to see to look for it, it was no longer at the spot we saw it. Mind you, when we saw it, we booked it and left hella fast because we were all shitting our pants. But kid you not, when we went back to San Felipe, the fog was mostly gone. I think there's definitely something going on at San Felipe. Also take the depictions of the translucent square and the creature with a grain of salt. Everything happened so fast that when we saw it, we panicked and drove by very fast. But we definitely saw something by the tree, and it's never anything we've seen before. Definitely not monkeys since monkeys don't live around here. And it was able to fully grasp the entire tree, and it was a big ass tree. Also, I live near the area, and once I heard a shriek from there. My friends also heard a loud scream from there. Is there something bigger going on in this road? This road is very close to a residential area but doesn't connect to anything and has been cited for many paranormal activities. Is there something bigger going on? Apparently there have been people in black cloaks. I'm scared as f now since I live close to the road. Will I be okay? Camping trip. So my birthday was recently, and I had a buddy come in from out of town to celebrate, and we decided we wanted to go out camping for a night. Well, we leave at 4 am, and once we leave the interstate to turn on a dirt road, it will take about an hour and a half to reach our spot. But I kid you not, the millisecond we hit that road, it was straight primal fear, and it came and went in waves but got worse every time it peaked. And nothing was said between me and my friend to add to the fear other than 20 minutes, and he was like, "Man, I know you don't like talking about this, but I've felt something for a while now," and I agreed. By the time we made it to the camp spot turnoff, we both agreed we felt like we couldn't even stop the car, so we kept pushing to the next town and sat there till the sun came up, and once it did, we felt just fine, and this is when he dropped on me that he had been seeing people standing by the roadside occasionally the whole ride, and I didn't see that, but smelled stale cigarettes when the waves came and went. Fast forward, the daytime went just fine, but as night hit, we went to bed, and all night I heard people talking, and then a full-on shriek, and it was done. After that we went to sleep in the truck. My main reason for posting this is just to see if any of you have any ideas about what was going on. I will add there was a very unfortunate massacre of native people there about 200 years ago, so I don't know if that will help. Thanks all. Disappearing house in the woods. When I was maybe 12 years old or younger, I and my buddy went into the woods. For context, we knew these woods like the back of our hand. Every detail there was to know about it, we knew. So one day we went in, and we were exploring as usual until we found a cupboard door, like any regular kitchen cupboard door, but it was on the ground. When we flipped it up, we were almost surprised to see nothing underneath, but we persisted. Suddenly, we began to see plants we'd never seen before, flowers I've never seen before, and the terrain was unrecognizable. These woods weren't very big, it would only take maybe 5 minutes to get to the other side, but for some reason, we had been walking for longer than that. My internal clock told me something was off. Why hadn't we reached the end yet? Until all of a sudden, as if we had blinked, there was a white house with pristine grass and a perfect lawn-shaped square around it. I and my buddy were shocked, but for some reason, we decided to turn around and go back as to not disturb whoever lived there, and it's a decision I've regretted all these years. We went back to try and find it, and we never could. We couldn't find the door either, which I think relates to this for some reason. If anyone has any theories or experiences, please respond to this. I want to find it again. I want to know what I'd seen. I used to live in a log cabin in the woods. One afternoon I went to my friend's house, which was less than a mile from mine. So a fairly short, easy walk along a small paved road, although with lots of switchbacks and turnoffs. Anyway, I stayed at his house past dark, which I was really not supposed to do, but it wasn't the end of the world either. Nonetheless, I realized I better get home shortly after dark, so I started walking. After a few minutes, I became aware that it was getting harder to see, but I figured that no matter how dark it was, my eyes would eventually adjust, so I continued on down the road. Soon I found myself in absolute pitch black. I held my hand up right in front of my face and could not see it. This was how I discovered that when you are out of reach of any lights, and there is no moon, and the sky is very overcast, you can in fact find yourself with no light at all. I tried to look back toward my friend's house to see if I could see the lights from his parents' cabin. But I could not. Besides, without any point of reference, I wasn't even certain anymore that I was looking back or which way I was really looking at all. Now I wasn't truly lost, as I knew which road I was on and roughly where I was in relation to my own house. But I was far from certain I could find my way. I spent the next hour or so literally feeling my way along the ground with my hand to confirm there was still paved road beneath my feet. Somehow, through a combination of luck and general knowledge of the features of the road, I made it far enough to bring my own porch light in sight. Something in the woods. This is something that has been bothering me, but I don't think I have put it together until now. My brother, stepbrother, and cousin all witnessed a strange occurrence/animal, or something, in the woods when we were all 13 years old. My cousin died a couple of months later in a four-wheeler accident, my stepbrother was murdered in 2018, and my brother to this day will not speak or acknowledge what they saw that day. The day they saw whatever it was, I remember that it was right at dusk. All three of them came rushing back home crying and screaming, telling our parents what they had seen, and it was just written off as a bear or some kind of animal. Just for reference, we live in South GA, about an hour from Savannah, Georgia. They said the animal/thing stood on its back legs and was running towards them on our pond trail. Side note, they had their headlights from our four-wheelers on and still couldn't make out what they saw. Just a black figure with red reflective eyes. Strange structures / unusual activity in local Irish forests. I've lived in the southeast of Ireland my entire life. I've got the type of autism that compels me to go out and explore, so wandering through trees and fields has been my pastime since long before I can remember. I'm also young and very fit and strong, which will be a reference point for what I want to try to describe. One of the woods near my house is a common walk / run spot for me, but in the decade plus I've been visiting, I've never shaken the discomfort I've felt in there, day or night. I've happened upon a few curious sights and always played it off as wind and weather or local people with their kids, but to my recollection I've met a total of 6 separate people and never beyond the tree line. What I've seen I've looked into but never made conclusions. It's been very difficult too. Small to large structures made out of broken trees, between a couple of feet to full-sized pines. The trees never seem to match each other and come from other locations. I'm quite strong in weightlifting, and I couldn't imagine moving some of the ones I've seen, especially when the break points are sometimes far above 10 feet high. Impressions, markings, and footprints near and around these areas. My initial thoughts are still human activity based on shape but not size and location. Noises that sound like a knockoff cow or owl as well as sounds of movement are never close by. Even when farmers have tucked all their animals away for winter. Nothing is without explanation in nature, and weather here can lead to some wild things, but those who spend enough time outdoors can begin to see the patterns of how these things affect the environment. My main questions are, has anyone else experienced something similar, and what is the explanation? Thank you to all who can make some sense of this. Strange experience when I was younger. I live in Washington, kind of in the sticks, a small town covered in forest and clouds. We built our house from scratch in kind of a secluded area deeper into the trees, so walking to my house is unheard of. About 4 miles of highway along a strip of water, cliffs, and trees just to get to my area. Nothing ever happened out there. I would see deer and watch the trees blow or listen to them go back and forth with the wind. But one night I was listening to the rain and would sleep right under the window so I could get some fresh air while I slept. I couldn't sleep, so I flipped over on my stomach so I could see outside. Underneath a streetlight, I could see what looked to be a pretty skinny dog, so I thought to myself, coyote, common here. Then it did something eerie to me and began to stand on its hind legs under the street lamp and kind of stayed there. I shivered at the sight alone but turned around to sleep and tried to not let it bother me. I was younger, so that kind of stuff creeped me out. About 30 minutes later, around 12:30 a.m., I toss and turn and catch a glimpse that the coyote hasn't moved an inch. Still on its hind legs. This really had me geeked out, so I closed the blinds and shut the window a little bit, closed my eyes, and finally slept. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to something. What? But I started hearing the gravel bed outside my room shift. I hear the sound of footsteps on the rocks. I hear it again, but it's a little more distinct. I remember hearing the next set sound like it's right outside my open window, and I froze up there. After a few seconds of silence, I hear the footsteps go away, and I end up staying there for an hour before I go back to bed. I woke up in the morning, let my dog out, checked outside my room, and looked at the gravel bed. I saw 2 boot-sized footprints embedded in the rocks facing my window. I go inside quickly to ask my dad if he took the dog out last night or walked into the gravel bed, and he said he didn't go outside at all in the rain. I told him about the coyote, but he seemed to be more concerned with the boot prints and bought cameras that day, but nothing happened after that. I still don't know if a person was outside my window looking into my room, but being the scared kid I was, I didn't want to find out. I've got one that, I don't believe, is supernatural but definitely got my blood pumping. Bow hunting for whitetail in the Northeast, I had a good feeling, so I stayed a little later than usual in the woods. Eventually, as the sun began to set and the temperature dropped, I heard the faint sound of hooves crunching on the fall leaves, but I could definitely see him behind me. I'm ground hunting, so I don't move a muscle and hope he circles. After about 5 minutes, it's starting to get dark when suddenly whoosh. A deer in rut is known to blow out its nostrils. I could literally feel the hot breath on my neck. I spin completely around, expecting a 12-point giant looking at me, and, nothing, not even the slightest crunch, just me and the woods alone. Once I jumped a moose, at least that's what I'm guessing it was, but I never saw it even though it was no more than 20 feet from me. That sucker waited till I was about on top of it when it just took off, and let me tell you, it was the middle of a summer day, dead quiet, and that thing was like a freight train through there. I could see the tops of the saplings making a V where he was running. Creepy one? Not mine but my old man's story, and he's a pretty no bullshit kind of guy. Deer hunting in that exact spot where I had my experience, There's a trail about 50 yards or so behind where we sat. The area is a typical New England forest, characterized by its hilly terrain. Anyway, Pops catches some movement out of the corner of his eye on the trail. Well, it turns out it's another hunter, so the old man minds his business but just watches this guy go by when he realizes something is off about him. Now he swears for his life that this guy's legs weren't moving at all, as if he were gliding across the forest floor down and up the knolls. He waited until the guy was no longer visible before declaring it a day and leaving the area. Scary encounter with something. So I live in the southeastern corner of South Dakota. There aren't a lot of wooded areas down here, but there are some. My boyfriend and I have been spending lots of time exploring the few wooded areas that we have. Yesterday afternoon, we visited this particular area. We would not have expected anything to happen because it was still decently close to the town of Brandon. If anything, our primary concern would have been the safety of the people. This park/wooded area has lots of things to explore for the area, and we brought one of his friends with us. We are more intense with our hikes than he is, so he let us leave him behind, and we went exploring off the beaten trail and did our own thing. By the time we were getting back to the area we left him, the sun was starting to set, and he wasn't there, so we called him up, and he said he was headed back to the car. It's important to note that during this time we were making these screams back and forth at each other, trying to see if we could hear each other beyond the phone. Boyfriend and I had one more trail we wanted to explore, so we headed down that trail, and then eventually it was actually getting dark, so we made it back to the trail that took us back to the car. We were walking through the woods and joking about how a friend was probably going to try and scare us or some shit. We saw a deer and didn't think anything of it, but it slightly startled me originally. Finally, as we reached the point where the woods transition into prairie, we heard a scream and witnessed a swift, deer-like leap through a tree that appeared to be divided into two branches. I am unsure of an effective way to describe the tree layout. We, being logical, began calling out to his friend, saying, "Hey, you caught us." It's not funny, but it was evident that it was not our friend. After that, we experienced a slight sense of unease, but we quickly accelerated our pace towards the car. He and I took turns kind of looking back behind us, and I saw what looked like an obese man just kind of standing on the trail behind us, but it had more of a ghost-like presence to it than an actual man. Boyfriend looked back at some point and said, "Hey, I don't want to scare you, but it almost looks like there is a person back there or something." My face just dropped, and I said word for word, "You saw it too?" And then we just kind of looked at each other and ran. We ended up taking the wrong path, so we had to run a lot longer. We eventually made it back to the car. His friend was there, and he swears on his life he wasn't ducking with us. Either way, this dude could not have run that fast or looked like what we saw behind us. As soon as we arrived home, we began researching the situation. We think it could be a skinwalker, but also this is South Dakota. We're on Lakota Sioux land, not Navajo land. Regardless, it was an extremely unsettling encounter. This experience happened 20 years ago in April of 2004 outside a small town named Smoky Lake that is located in Alberta, Canada. We were celebrating a couple of birthdays, and the group decided to go to the snowmobile shack located in the pines outside of town. I started to feel uneasy as we approached the shack. We were totally surrounded by trees, and the feeling just kept getting stronger. The gang all decided we were going to eat some magic mushrooms and party in the shack. We all ate some, and I quickly exited the shack, regretting my decision. Now it takes time for mushrooms to kick in, and while I was having a cigarette outside, I started to stare into the trees, and then to my horror, I noticed there was something staring at me, and it had a sinister smile. Its face blended in with trees, but I could see the eyes and teeth. I was frozen in place until the Chevy pickup truck pulled up. My friend's girlfriend dropped him off at the shack. We then all walked into the shack, and I told the guys what I saw. They all laughed at me and called me a pussycat. Well, that pussycat left the shack and headed back to town with my friend's girlfriend. The mushrooms finally hit me on the way home, and it was bad. Still to this day, no one believes me, and I stay away from the deep woods. Woods of Appalachia. I live in the Appalachian Mountains near the trail, and I have been in the same house in the woods my whole life, still in high school. When I started having weird woods experiences months ago, my ex thought it was because I accidentally sat in a fey trap, a tree growing 3 trunks with water in the middle, but first I saw a deer vertebrae stuck in a bush 4 feet off the ground. I didn't put it there, and no one else goes in the woods behind my house besides hunters, but it wasn't hunting season, and I followed a turkey from the cornfield into the woods, but it was gone with no movement anywhere, and there was black goo all over the trees and undergrowth, from spotted lanternflies maybe? And I got the deep gut feeling that I'm unsafe and being watched, so I ran home. Then later I got that same feeling but smelled rotten flesh, no body or flies anywhere. I smelled it for a second, then again, and then it was gone. I've watched some ghost channels, and apparently that smell is an indicator of a malevolent spirit, and finally today I went back out. I heard some big movements in the woods, but again, nothing I could see. Then the wind picked up steadily, and I heard thunder, plus a siren in the distance, but that doesn't really mean anything. I got the deep gut feeling to run and that I'm being watched, so I got out of there, and as I'm going home, I hear a human sounding yelp faintly from behind me. Naturally, I keep walking. Then I hear it again. It kind of sounds like a man's voice. The first time it sounded like my dad, and it was yelling in threes. No actual words, just a yell 3 times. I hear it again and again, each getting louder, and then finally I got back to my house to post this because it was really weird in threes, because that's another thing I've seen in the ghost hunting videos, things coming in threes. Anyway, thanks for listening. The scariest thing that's ever happened to me in the woods. This happened about 4 years ago. Thinking about it still makes my skin crawl and my heart pound. Sorry if it's a bit long. We camped for the night in the Stanislaus National Forest near Big Trees, California. We were only about 15 minutes off the main road but in a pretty remote area, basically dirt fire roads and nothing but trees in all directions. We arrived in the early afternoon and set up camp in a nice clearing at the top of a hill beside the road and drank some beer while we cooked dinner. We saw maybe 4 cars go by in the hours between when we arrived and nightfall, all hunters leaving the forest. By 7 o'clock the sun had mostly set, and it was getting dark. The solitude and peacefulness of the woods was nice, but it felt just a little odd being so secluded. I've been camping probably 50 times but I've always been with a larger group or at a dedicated campsite. After dinner, when it was dark, we hung a bear bag with all of our food stuff and smoked a joint, lying back on a blanket looking up at the stars. I was feeling good and pretty much forgot about the fact that we were alone in the middle of the forest. We got into the tent and sat in the darkness and talked for at least an hour. I'm a tall guy, but my 2-man tent is high enough that I can sit up inside of it without a problem. The rain fly was laying on top of the tent, kind of flung over the top but not attached or staked down, fully covering one side and draped over so that the other side was mostly unobstructed. We had a clear view out of the mesh siding, and the trees were barely illuminated by the moon in front of us. Here's where it got spooky. I had been doing a lot of browsing and decided to tell my GF about 3 Kings. Basically a sub dedicated to this spooky ritual where you sit in a darkened room at 3 a.m. and set up a candle and 2 mirrors, and through some combination of supernatural forces and sleep deprivation, images appear in the mirrors and speak to you. I was having fun scaring her, and, to be honest, I was scaring myself a little. My hair is standing on end as I recall this. The woods were dead silent, and there was absolutely no wind. There was no sound of rustling or any movement of air. It would have been very easy to feel even the slightest breeze sitting like we were. I paused in my story, and as I did, the rain fly started to ever so slowly draw back from the top of the tent. It didn't fall off, it wasn't blown, honest to God, it was as if someone was carefully pulling it down from behind us. I will never forget the sound it made. We turned and stared at each other wide-eyed, and my heart was in my throat. The fly continued to slide ever so slowly down the tent until it was completely off. It was too dark to see clearly behind us, but my mind conjured all the nightmarish beings I've ever seen in horror movies. I'd like to say I sprang into action and ensured our safety, but I was literally frozen. What a feeling. We sat in stunned silence for maybe 10 seconds until I finally found it in myself to grab my flashlight and look behind us. There was nothing there. We breathed a huge sigh and started whispering feverishly. What the duck? Did you? I got out and looked all around the clearing but felt stupid after a while, and we went to sleep. The next morning, we woke up early and packed up camp. It was sunny and quiet, and I was happy to be in the woods, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling from the night before. I was on my knees rolling up the tent but kept glancing through the trees around us kind of compulsively, and my girlfriend was packing up breakfast about 30 feet in front of me. Again, there was absolutely nobody around, and no birds chirping or animals in sight. Then, I heard from directly behind me 2 quick thwacks. Thock, thock. Loud, and about 2 seconds apart. Like the sound of an axe hitting a tree. I judged the source of the sound as within 100 feet of me. My girlfriend sprang up as I wheeled around to look behind me, but there was nothing there. We both said, "Oak, time to GTFO of here," and left in a hurry. My heart didn't stop pounding until we were back on the main road. I heard music in the woods yesterday. I was hiking on my family's farm with my dog, like I do every day. I've seen some weird things, but never music. I was sitting on a fallen tree deep in the woods. It's a spot I often frequent. I was there maybe 3 hours before I heard anything. I was sitting there listening to a podcast and drawing when my dog started whimpering and whining. I paused my podcast to comfort him when I heard it. It was extremely faint. I could barely hear it, and it took a lot of straining. If I had to describe what it sounded like, I'd say an old ice cream truck playing a poor recreation of the US anthem. The first 2/3 RDS of the song were unique. I cannot for the life of me remember the tune. However, the last 1/3 sounded exactly like "Thee and the Flag" was still there. Part of the anthem. After that, it was a second or so of silence before it began again. The whole song lasted about 12 seconds before looping. After about 20 seconds of it playing, I began getting nervous and started walking home. I hummed the song the whole way home. Eventually I couldn't hear it anymore, and as soon as I stopped humming, I immediately forgot the song. I tried to remake the tune, but I just couldn't do it. Any theories on what it might be? I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It started, unprompted, seemingly out of nowhere. It never got quieter as I walked, it just suddenly faded out after about 5 minutes of walking. What bothers me is that it seriously freaked out my dog. He was whining and barking, and he was really just freaking out. I think I encountered a mimic. So this story happened a long while ago. I was maybe around 11 or 12 and out with a friend of mine. She came up with the idea we go ghost hunting in a graveyard during midday on a busy Sunday, which I found useless but agreed to anyways. This graveyard was near a forest, so deep down I was happy to know she came up with this idea during the daytime. After a while of walking, we arrived at the graveyard, which was oddly empty given how graveyards on Sundays are always kind of full, but we ignored it, not instantly thinking about how this is all about ghosts. We found an empty, dug-out place for a new casket, which we found disturbing and sad. We looked around at graves and the names of the deceased, and stupidly, we began making fun of the people's names. I was the first to start, to which my friend then followed. After a while of making fun of the dead, we heard loud and clear as day my name being called from somewhere deep within the graveyard. We stopped laughing and making noise, and we looked from where the sound was coming from. We began walking away, but then we heard my name being called out again. This time it sounded as if it was coming from everywhere. The noise was unbelievably static-like, and we freaked out. We ran away because 2 11-12-year-old girls alone in a graveyard near a forest isn't the best idea and could easily turn out bad. We ran back into the city after a very painfully long hike, where we once again heard my name getting called out, but this time it sounded exactly like my aunt's voice. It couldn't have been her because during that time she moved to England. I called her regardless to ask if she's back in the city, to which she told me she wasn't. We ignored the incident for the remaining day, and I walked my friend home. She lives in a house, so it was a 10 to 20 minute walk from my own place. After we said our goodbyes for the day, I walked back home. When I arrived, I saw that she had called me 10 or so times, spamming me, telling me that what I was doing wasn't funny. I was confused and told her I'm not doing anything, to which she called me absolutely furious, crying and yelling at me that she's not my friend anymore. I got angry and started yelling back, asking her what this was all about. She then called me on camera and showed me a direct copy of me at her door. I was left completely speechless. It had my voice, it had my look. Everything about it was exactly like me. When she saw the fact I truly was home, we hung up and called for her parents. From that day on, I keep having odd things happen to me. I keep seeing shadow figures. Sometimes when I'm out on my own and returning home, I see figures that are fully white and slightly translucent. I keep hearing knocking on my window. I live on the 4th floor, and there are no trees tall enough to bang on my window. What could it have been? The forest. I moved away from my parents and into my first apartment. It's a good location, close to town, beach, and forest with lots of water, perfect for long walks and nature stuff. The forest has a lot of swamp area and direct access to flowing water on one side. It's about 2.5 kilometers long by 500 meters wide, so it's not the biggest forest, but it's the creepiest. I have often walked through forests at night, finding them to be quite cozy and the darkness beneficial for my light-sensitive eyes. I haven't been scared in the past forests, as far as I can remember. I remember the first time walking through this tiny forest, and I knew instantly that there was something not quite right. However, this was during the daytime. Have you ever heard the expression "the forest has eyes"? In this case, it's quite literal. You feel watched as soon as you enter and until you leave on the other side. The forest is so thin at times that you can see the water on the other side and know that you're all alone, yet it feels like 1,000 eyes are following your every move. I thought that it was just forest paranoia, but every time I come there, it doesn't matter what time of the year, it's the same. Even dogs I meet on my way with their owners seem upset all the time. I was walking through it one evening to see if I could find the peace that I usually could in other forests at nighttime, but that was a hard no. Not only did the eyes of the forest feel more appealing, but there was a feeling of dread there, which wasn't there at daytime at all. I started noticing balls of light, some big and others very small, floating in between trees, path trees, water. At first I thought that it was some sort of insect or maybe boats on the water, but after checking the water, there were never any boats. I just hurried home. I have been to the forest alone and with others, and we always saw the balls of light on a hill where the path is at the top and the hill descends 10 to 12 meters to the water. The balls are floating 7 to 10 meters above ground level, in and out between trees. I don't like entering the forest anymore, and I'll do my very best to avoid it. It's evil. Strange childhood experience. Most of the time when I tell this childhood experience of mine to people, they don't know what to say. I've never met anyone that can relate to this, and my own family doesn't believe me about it. I grew up in a small town in NH. I used to play in the woods a lot as a young kid. I was usually told to stay close enough to the house that I could hear my mom yell to me to come home. There were tons of rocks and trees to play with. I believe I was around 7 to 8 at the time. One day my mom was working, and my dad was home watching me. I told him I was going to head out into the woods and go a little farther than usual, but I wouldn't be gone for too long. He said okay, but be safe, I'm going to take a nap. I knew that meant I had a few hours. I decided to go farther into the woods than I had ever gone. I knew there was a dirt road about half a mile straight back from my backyard through the woods. I put a watch on my wrist, and I packed a bag with water in case something happened or I couldn't find my way home. I watched the time on my watch as I had walked straight back out into my backyard in a straight line through the back of the woods so that I could walk straight back to get home. I was young, I had no idea how long it took to walk half a mile. I walked for about 1 hour when I started to get a little worried that I hadn't found the road yet. Then all of a sudden I could see something in the distance that looked like water. As I got closer, it seemed that there was a huge, beautiful lake. It was the most beautiful lake I had ever seen still to this day. It had the perfect reflection, and I remember it looking so serene. There were no houses on the lake that I could see at least, it looked like the water went on forever. The only sight of human activity was what appeared to be 3 old, falling apart wooden cabins. Something about them seemed old/air. I remember yelling hello just to hear the sound of my voice echo and no reply. I remember I wanted to make sure I wasn't on the cabin owner's property. I wanted to go down to the water and touch it, but I just happened to be up on a steep cliff-like edge with lots of sand and rocks going down. I was afraid if I went down I wouldn't be able to get back up by myself. I was so excited to have found the lake. I wanted to show my parents so they could take me back there to get down to the water safely. So I had looked at my watch and said, okay, it took me 1 hour to get here, it should take me 1 hour to walk straight back and get home. After walking in the woods for about 1 hour, I had started to worry a little but kept walking straight. After 1 hour and 6 minutes, I finally saw my house. As I had gotten back, my mom was just getting home from work. I ran inside and told my parents what I had found and asked them to go for a walk with me to show them. They were shocked at what I was saying and told me that was impossible and that there was no lake behind us or any large bodies of water in those woods. They said that it was impossible that I walked for 1 hour straight back because after half a mile I would have hit the dirt road and then the highway. They refused to go out there with me and asked if I had fallen and hit my head. My mom said that I must have daydreamed it or fallen asleep in the woods and dreamt it. I remember it clear as day because it was the first time that they refused to believe what I was telling them, and their reaction to what I had told them shocked me as well. To this day I have so many questions. I have never gone out there by myself since then. I don't know if seeing the lake was a spiritual symbol of some sort or if I came close to something negative/evil. I have so many questions about what/why that happened. If anyone has any information, please comment. This incident happened in 2019, and to this day I still can't find an answer. There is a short, 20-minute trail in Nopiming called Walking on Ancient Mountains. It's basically a hike up a huge rock that brings you above the tree line. You get 360 degrees views of the lakes and forest around you, and there are a few picnic tables up there to eat breakfast as it's a great place to watch the sunrise. So my boyfriend and I drove out there, we lost signal, and the last thing we had passed was a campsite about 22 kilometers down the gravel road before our stop. So we were pretty isolated. We get there at roughly 1 a.m. and had made a bed in the backseat/trunk of our SUV, so when we get there, we can snooze for a while before hiking up. So we pull up to the base of the trail and want to use the outhouse and get ready to sleep. We honk the horn, slam the doors, and yell to scare away any animals nearby, like bears and such, before we walk maybe 40 feet to the bathroom. After all that, We hop into bed, lock the doors, and within that same minute we hear heavy footsteps in the gravel outside the car. Step, step, drag. Step, step, drag. After being frozen in fear for a moment and hearing these footsteps approach the car, I quickly scramble to the front seat, start the car, and shine my lights around to see what's out there. But there's nothing. No tracks in the gravel, no signs left behind that anything was out there. I do a quick circle shining my lights bright in the bush that's surrounding us, and we don't see anything. But I was so scared I stayed up for nearly an hour shining my lights and waiting for something to come back out. After not seeing anything, I figured whatever it was had passed through and isn't coming back. So I turned the light off and crawled to the bed in the back where my boyfriend slept. With no exaggeration, the moment I lay my head back down, we hear the footsteps again. This time walking from the rear driver's side wheel well, where my head lies, around the trunk, and to the wheel well next to my boyfriend's head. We look up through the windows, too scared to move, but don't see anything. Then suddenly, there are loud, slow scratches in the wheel well next to my boyfriend's head. Scratch. Scratch. My boyfriend hits the wall of the car to scare it away. But it sticks around. And after all of this, I don't remember why we had stayed and not gotten the hell out of there. Maybe at the time we figured it was over a 3-hour drive from Winnipeg to get there, and we'd hate to have wasted all that time. Either way, we stuck it out. The footsteps and scratching went on for most of the night, and once it was the tiniest bit light out where we could see our surroundings better, the sound stopped, and we slapped on some headlamps and started our hike. At the time it was too dark to see, but once we got back from our sunrise breakfast on top of the rock, we saw the tire where the scratching had been was flat, no explanation as to why. We got it changed out and headed home. But to this day, when we think about it, there's no animal that I know that would behave like that, have those heavy, specific footsteps, which in my mind at that moment seemed like a person dragging something, a body. I'm not a huge ghost believer, but I've considered it an option, as perhaps this big rock that sticks out about the tree line could have been a significant spot for indigenous people at one point. I considered a Wendigo. Or even a real human. But I can be certain it wasn't an animal. Has anyone else had a similar experience in the Manitoba wilderness? So, the first time something happened, my little brother and I were hanging out with some friends in a little valley right next to the fence that separated our property from the woods. It was broad daylight during our summer break. We were all just kind of chilling, being goofy. Doing kid things. My dad had already had his first experience with whatever was back there and had told my brother and me about it while also telling us that we were not allowed to go back there. I want to say I was about 11. We were telling our friends about what our upstairs neighbor had told my dad about these woods. Again, for more context, please read my first submission. My friends and I all lived right around these woods, and of course they all called BS. My brother, trying to be cool and edgy, took his soda can and flung it over the fence, saying, "This is my sacrifice to the demon in the woods." We were all giggling and egging him on. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were coming really fast, almost like someone was running towards us in the fence. Nothing was there, but about 6 of us saw the weeds going down, like someone was stepping on them. Then, whatever it was, hit the fence with a loud ping, and we all ran for our lives. The ping sounded almost like fingers or fingernails hitting the fence. Again, broad daylight, nothing there. This happened before my nightmares started. I want to say those came about a year later. I'm glad to say that the nightmares have stopped, hopefully forever, as of now, but they had come back with full force for a few months. I still stay in contact with one of my friends from that time. He, my brother, and I will never forget that day. I do believe it was my first encounter with whatever haunts those woods. It definitely was not my last, though. Something chased me out of the woods in Indiana. This took place at around 11 p.m. on a Wednesday night in 2015. Let me start this story off like this. I am an avid coyote hunter and used to absolutely love hunting them at night when they were most active. One afternoon I decided I was going to take off and go hunting after the sun went down. I get home, load my gear, and hit the road. About an hour later, I pull into the parking area for the state forestry that I'm going to hunt. This particular place that I chose, I've had luck in the past and knew of a den about a mile from the main trail. So I set off down the graveled path, unknowing of what I was about to encounter in just a short while. My strategy is to walk 100 yards at a time, stop, and blast a coyote locator call until I hear one respond. On the first set, nothing. Second set, nothing. However, on the third set, everything changed. The trail that I'm on makes a really sharp, almost hairpin turn to the right, and in the middle of that hairpin is a Civil War-era cemetery with a dense pine thicket behind it and a very steep bottom across the trail in front. I have a habit of walking through the cemetery and touching the main headstone. Almost as a sign of respect or something. As I'm walking up to the headstone, I hear the faint sound of something landing on the ground in the pine thicket. The weird thing was that I only heard one boom, as if a human or bipedal thing touched down. Usually, animals, bobcats, when they jump to the ground, it's front paws first and then the rear, so boom, boom. Immediately, I started to feel uneasy and wanted to leave. The only problem? Whatever was in that pine thicket stood between me and the only way back to my truck. I started to notice the silence. Like everything that was just making noise a minute ago was gone. At this point in time, I noticed the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I immediately started scanning the pine thicket to see if I could see something, anything that would make this bizarre situation make sense. I scanned for what felt like hours until finally I noticed it. On the edge of the thicket there was this thing. Too tall to be human, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. I could only make out the outline, but it looked emaciated and deathly. My mind had to be playing tricks on me, because this is the stuff you only read about and never encounter. My reality soon changed when this thing darted to the right and ran down to the bottom. This bottom was about 300 to 400 feet deep and very steep, but whatever that was got to the bottom of it in no time flat. The path to my truck was now clear, and I was trying to come up with a plan to make it. But, as I would soon discover, the thing ran into the bottom to better position itself for an ambush from behind. I waited about 5 more minutes before I decided to move. I took one step forward and heard it. It was in the bottom directly below me, slowly working its way up the hill. I bolted straight across the trail, through the cemetery, and into the pine thicket toward the main road. I ran about 100 yards and stopped. The scariest part? When I stopped, it stopped. The entire time I was running, I could hear it running behind me, gaining on me. I always carry a pistol when I hunt, and it is always in a holster on my chest just in case. I decided that the only way I was making it out of here alive was to dump and run. Essentially, you fire in the direction of the threat until your mag is empty, and then you run like hell. I had 3 mags in total, 51 bullets between me and certain death. I counted, 1, 2, 3, bang. I emptied the mag and made a mad dash as far as I could, never hearing the thing behind me. I stopped after what felt like hours, reloaded, and readied for another barrage of bullets. About 15 seconds after stopping, I started to hear crashing, like a big animal was blasting through trees running in my direction. Bang! I dumped and bolted. This time the plan was to run all the way to the truck, about half-mile from my current position through the woods. This time while running, I could hear it, getting closer and closer. I jumped behind a fallen log to reload one last time. The thing stopped, but I could hear its breath. I could hear the low growl this thing had, like a dog or coyote mixed with something from the pits of hell. Bang! 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 The slide of my pistol locked back, and I was off, the truck now in sight. I ran for about 70 yards. I ran faster than I ever have in my entire life. I made it, finally. Jumped in, started my truck, and got the hell out of there, the entire time scanning the woods on either side and behind me. I've never been back in the woods of Brown County, Indiana, at night alone, and more than likely never will. I was driving out to a new campsite in an unknown area with 3 friends around 11 p.m. We were on a main 2-lane highway, and most of the drive was completely dark after we left our main city. It was a 3 hours drive, and occasionally we'd roll through a small town, slow down, and pass on. About 3/4 of the way through our trip, I saw a row of brightly lit streetlights shining on what looked like a quaint little neighborhood, covered in a thick patch of forest. I quickly exited, still noticing the row of streetlights that seemed to stretch for a mile or so ahead of us, parallel to the highway. The exit only let me turn one way, and we started driving through a small neighborhood. We quickly went from the bright streetlights to almost complete darkness. I could still see them in my rear view, reflecting through the pines. About 5 minutes into this neighborhood, we started to notice every single house we passed had the lights off. I couldn't see the original streetlights in the mirror anymore, but I could see what looked like the glow of a gas station sign ahead. We slowly passed it, abandoned. 15 more minutes up the same road and we all decide we likely took the wrong exit. This is a ghost town, so we turned around. Passed the abandoned gas station again and continued to follow the same road we took in. Driving, and I'm just waiting to see the streetlights pop through the trees. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Okay, we should be, boom, I see the glow of the reflectors on the highway. But where the duck are the streetlights? It was shocking. We continued to resume our trek up the highway, the same highway we exited from. But there were no streetlights. No houses are being lit up by the lights, just trees. I turned us around, and sure enough, Ghost Town was still there. Turned around again, came to the highway, the same area we exited. There was no row of streetlights. Complete darkness. We were terrified. This happened 2 weeks ago. I had gone on a camping trip with some families in CA at a campsite called Ice House. I've always been independent, and my siblings and cousins are all in relationships, so I have my own tent. This was about 3 days into camping. It was maybe around 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. ISH, and everyone was dead asleep. I was just on my phone watching videos. I heard footsteps around my tent, mistaking them for one of my family members. I yelled out, "Duck you," before the footsteps ceased. It sounded like literal footsteps. I unzipped my tent window and looked in the direction the steps came from, and no one was ducking there. I personally am not a huge believer in the paranormal/ghost. I shrugged it off and thought of it as an animal. The next night, everyone was partying and drinking. I had gone to the forest to go take a leak. From the corner of my eyes, I saw someone standing behind me. I quickly turned around, and there was a man standing by the tree. I'd say he was about 10 feet away from me. It looks to me like a hiker with a huge backpack. But it was late at night. I ran. Didn't even think about looking back. Ran to my dad, and my dad grabbed his shotgun, and we all as a group went to look for this man. Couldn't find him, so my dad called the ranger the next morning and reported the incident. The ranger's exact words were, "We have had a lot of paranormal activities in this exact area." Chills down my spine literally, but he said he doesn't know if anyone has passed away here or not yet. Packed up, and left to an area where there were people so we'd feel safer. To this day, I just think about if that was an actual person or was it a ghost. Overall, this made me a 100% believer. Seeing the face of a ghost is scary because they don't ducking blink. I don't know why, but after this encounter, I can't even sleep for shit anymore. I guess I'm still spooked about it. The lights. Before I start this, I want to say I grew up around a lot of brujerias, which for English speakers are witches. I have always believed in ghosts. Sure, I don't have a lot of scientific evidence to support it, but I've seen some strange things before in my life. When I was much younger, maybe around 6 or 7, my family and I went out to the mountains for a 3-day camping trip. I lived in Colorado at the time, in a smaller town, so I was always surrounded by mountains. I remember driving up this dirt hill at like 1 in the morning. My family was a bit late arriving at the spot while my mom's friends were waiting for us at the spot. To give some visuals on this spot, it's a meadow area surrounded by hills and mountains. A small part of a forest is also nearby, as well as a small stream of water, which I never figured out where it led to. On this drive towards the camping spot, it was bumpy, so I barely could sleep, so I mostly just stared out the window. It was mostly dark, but I found the silhouettes of the trees and mountains. It was satisfying enough to keep my 7-year-old mind occupied during the long, bumpy trip. After an hour of driving, I noticed a little light ahead of us. It was like an orb. I hope I mentioned this, but there was nothing around, nothing electrical, that could have caused this orb. It was moving so slowly in the air. It was above the cliff too. I don't know how to describe it, but it would take form as a square and then back to a circle. As we continued driving, more began showing. These white orbs were just floating in a line as if they were taking us to where we needed to go. My mom and my stepdad took notice of this too. We all stayed silent, just trying to figure out what these orbs were. They were so close to the car, like I could stand out of the window and reach them. We finally made it to the camping area, and the orbs had disappeared on us finally. But the orbs came back. After a day of hiking and riding 4-wheelers around, the sun was finally ready to rest, and we all got back to the tents and campfire. It was around 1 a.m. again, and everyone was sitting down by the fire talking and laughing. I didn't pay much attention to the adults at the time, just staring at the fire in silence. I remember everyone staying silent before my mom pointed up at the sky, maybe 10 feet up in the air, and gasping, "Look, there they are again." I looked up and saw the orbs again. There looked to maybe be at least 7 of them just floating in the air. It was like they were dancing, but they didn't move from their spot. Everyone was just silent, not saying anything else. We felt frozen, like we were scared to move. My neighbor came out of his camper and saw us all staring. He was only a year older than me. He saw the lights as well, and he took a picture of them on his phone. My mom did as well. At the time I was grounded, so I didn't have my phone. All of us stood there quietly just watching these orbs dance. They didn't feel scary, just as if they were existing with us as well. Maybe 2 hours passed, and we were still watching them. Eventually, the adults took us kids to bed, and we didn't hear much about the orbs after that. After the trip, and when my family came back home, we noticed the picture of the orbs was missing from our phones as if they never existed. We asked our neighbors, and their photos were missing as well. For years I've always thought about those orbs, wondering what they are, until last year I saw a video of these orbs just floating. I freaked out immediately and commented like crazy, saying I'd seen those before, but I got no replies. I still don't know what those orbs are to this day. I wonder if they were ghosts or maybe even aliens. I don't know, but if anyone can find that TikTok, please let me know. It was a Ring camera footage, and a small group of lights was just floating near the front door. If anyone has any possible answers to what I saw years ago, please let me know. Inexplicable occurrence in RRG, KY. I haven't been able to stop thinking about this incident and wanted to see if it resonates with anyone else. I, male, 28, my wife, female, 28, and our dog, male, 3, recently went to Red River Gorge, a state park in SE, Kentucky. We're no strangers to camping in the park, having been there at least 20 times over the past 8 years. We chose a spot I've been to 2 to 3 times before. It's worth noting that this site is outside of other dispersed camping areas and is essentially the only proper spot with car parking along a 2-mile stretch of road. There's a dilapidated barn about a mile up from where we drove in and a cemetery about a third of a mile in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it's a rarely traveled road, and we saw no one all day, just an occasional car, maybe 1 or 2 an hour. The spot is at the base of a 30-foot incline that a 4x4 could handle. We parked our SUV horizontally at the top to prevent other vehicles from descending. From there, it's about 30 yards into the campground, with another slope leading to the river's edge and swimming hole. The day went great. We spent time near the beach, letting our dog swim, and then did typical camping activities like hiking, foraging, chopping wood, throwing the hatchet, and enjoying a few beers. Once sunlight began to fade around 6:30, we started the fire and began cooking dinner. As darkness fell and the last light disappeared, we heard the usual sounds, squirrels rustling, things falling into the leaves, which spooked my wife a bit, but we didn't think much of it. Then, at about 9 p.m., sitting around the healthy fire and listening to music, we heard heavy shuffling in the leaves, definitely something large or heavy. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the road, about halfway between us and our car. I stopped the music, and after about 10 seconds of dead silence, we heard the shuffling again. Before I could call out, we heard this strange and unnatural noise, something like a throttling, ascending pitch, mixed with a shriek. Neither of us can verbally describe it, and I can confidently say I've never heard anything like it before. It was about 20 to 25 feet away, just outside the reach of my headlamp. Our dog went insane, hair standing on end, barking incessantly into the darkness. He was on a long lead, or I'm sure he would have taken off after it. My wife and I were frozen. I was holding my hatchet and trying to catch any movement or sound to track. After about 2 to 3 minutes of that, with no further noises, I calmed the dog, and we grabbed some essentials and hurried to the car. Our adrenaline was pumping as we discussed coyotes, foxes, or other animals as the possible culprits. I didn't want to mention the possibility of people, as that would have heightened the paranoia. We eventually passed out after about an hour, but I spent the rest of the night in and out of shallow sleep, feeling very uncomfortable both mentally and physically. I've always struggled to sleep any way except fully horizontal. At around 3 a.m., right next to my head, I heard a singular knock on my window, like someone tapped the glass with one knuckle. My wife didn't wake up, and I scanned the outside of the car but didn't see or hear anything. I struggled to doze off again, and my heartbeat was rapid. When we finally got the first light around 7 a.m., we cooked breakfast, packed up our campsite, and got the hell out of Dodge. No prints or anything out of sorts with our remaining belongings either. What's strange to me is that after hearing the noise, we heard no additional heavy shuffling from the source. With our dog barking so aggressively, we should have heard whatever it was moving away. We've looked up various animal noises native to the gorge, and nothing even remotely resembles what we heard. The knock on the window was also isolated. There were no other noises or visible happenings outside the car immediately following. Lastly, I had a thought the day after we left. I remember whistling for our dog after dark since we had some scraps to give him near the fire. Immediately, I thought, shit, I shouldn't have whistled. But up until this trip, I've never been a believer of those superstitions. I just like to respect the folklore I've heard. In hindsight, we're now convinced I may have invited a Wendigo or skinwalker to our camp. I won't take those superstitions lightly again, and I'm sure this occurrence will affect at least my next few overnights in those woods. Strange forest. Out in the countryside of Texas, my grandparents owned an 8-acre lot backed up to a heavily wooded area with a creek bed running along the back fence. One summer's eve around my 8th birthday, my entire family had gathered for a cookout. I and my cousin Max were always running around together. That day was no different. I decided to head down the creek bed into the woods as I heard what sounded like a whisper beckoning me to follow deeper in. My cousin happily followed behind me as we walked over a fallen fence line. My cousin remembers vividly seeing a woman appear in front of me as I stepped over the last of the fencing. I continued walking obliviously as my cousin attempted to rush and follow me. However, he remembers the fencing seemingly reaching up and wrapping around his ankle, causing him to fall into mud. He says that I continued walking despite him yelling for me to help him. He took a second to look at his torn up ankle with barbed wire wrapped around it. Upon looking up, he said I was nowhere to be seen, and when my older brother came down the creek following his screams, he and my cousin claimed my footprints in the creek bed stopped just a few feet beyond the spot Max had seen me last. My entire family is adamant that I was gone for 4 hours. They had police scour the woods and dogs try to track, but nothing went beyond the last footsteps I left in the mud. Upon my return, they were all terrified and worried that something had happened, but I didn't have a scratch on me. What I remember about the events after stepping over the fence is hearing a distant song being sung by some soft feminine voice, the smell of wild berries and sweets, and a feeling of happiness increasing with every step. From my perspective, I found a small clearing where I relaxed, ate wild berries, and played with some small animals I could describe as weird-looking cats. After what felt like a few moments, I stood back up and noticed what appeared to be dozens of people hiding behind the trees. I looked around, slowly regaining my senses, wondering where my cousin went. I see the path I came down, and as I started towards it, the environment started feeling more off, like it didn't want me to leave. It was angry that I was even trying to leave. The movement of the people behind the trees began to increase, as if they were moving toward my exit to block me. I broke out running and managed to get out of the clearing, jumping over the fence line from before, noticing how dark it seemed now, and rushing up inside the house, where I was caught by my grandpa and grilled for answers as to where I had been, who the woman my cousin saw leading me off was, why I didn't stop and help my cousin, and what actually happened in the 4 hours I was gone. However, when I told them it felt like mere moments, my grandfather looked more concerned than anyone else. By the time we went back to my grandparents' home for my birthday party, he'd already built up a new fence and fixed the fallen one down the creek. He had even planted some herbs and stuff that quickly took over the fence line, sealing it off with vines and bushes. I've been back to their place once in the last few years. The new owners tore the fence and greenery out, opening up the creek again. As I went to drive off, I looked down the creek, seeing a little girl coming back up to the property and a strange woman in a hood standing just beyond where the fence used to be, smiling at me. The burial ground. It wasn't my friend who called me in the forest. Have you guys ever seen burial grounds in the middle of the forest? Have you wondered what a burial ground is doing there? What happened in the forest to have a burial ground in the middle of the forest? So, this incident happened during my university days just before graduation. So, I had to sign up for a camping retreat held by my university. Since I thought I would be with my friend throughout the camping session, I thought it wasn't a terrible idea after all. So, I met with her and the rest of them with my luggage bag back at our university after our classes that evening. The camping trip was a 3-day retreat, and we hoped that we would have fun during the camping session. We waited for the bus in front of our university, and the person in charge of this camping retreat took our names before entering the bus. Everything went on smoothly till we reached the campsite, which was a real forest site. There were some lodges nearby, and we checked in at one of the lodges opposite the forest. The place was hilly, so the chilly fog covered our visions of the mountains in front of us. Our cheeks were red due to the cold air that pierced them. My friend and I shared a room, and we were excited about it. Once we got up to our rooms, I was pretty disappointed by the room condition. There was a chair in the middle of the bathroom, and we were told not to move it no matter what happened. Besides that, to make it worse for us, our bed was sandy and damp. There were some cigarette butts found behind the curtains by the window that was facing the mountains. The only good thing we found was the view from our room, which was the majestic mountains and the tall trees that make up the forest. Luckily for us, we decided to bring sleeping bags and use those for that night. I told my friend that I could tell one of the housekeeping staff to clean our room the next day. We slept peacefully that night, and little did we know that we wouldn't be getting any more peaceful nights after that night. The next morning, I got up early to tell one of the lodge staff about our room's condition. They agreed to clean our room while we were out for our first activity. Our day started in the forest, and the morning sun was glaring at our faces without any mercy. We were tasked with jungle trekking that morning, and I thought it would be fun since my crush, Damon Blake, was in my group. So, we started exploring the forest and made sure that each of us followed the trail set by the person in charge. I made sure I did not make a fool of myself in front of Damon during our jungle trekking session. I was the last person behind in my group to follow them into the forest. My group mates were situated quite a distance from me. Suddenly, I heard someone calling out my name. The voice sounded like my friend's, and I wondered why she was calling out for me. I thought she had lost her way, and I wanted to help her. Thus, I tried to call out to my group mates and Damon, but they couldn't hear me. With a sigh, I began to follow my friend's voice, which required a detour from the trail. So, I broke off from my group mates and was heading towards the voice. Then, I felt a chill cold air brush behind me, and a hand landed on my shoulder. Thank God, it was just Damon who pulled me back. He asked me what happened and why I broke off from the group. I told him that I heard my friend calling my name, and I wanted to help her get back to the trail. He took a step back from me, and I could see that he was surprised by my reply. After a while, he explained that I froze a while back and did not reply to any of my group mates or him when they asked me where I was going. In confusion, I told Damon that they did not ask me anything, but instead I called out for them to tell them about the voice I heard, but they did not seem to respond. Immediately, Damon understood that something odd was about to happen, and before he could snap back to reality, I realized that we were standing on a burial ground. What is a burial ground doing in the middle of the forest? With my quick thinking, I grabbed Damon's hand and pulled him away from the burial ground, telling him not to look back. I could feel his hands were shaking in fear like a leaf, but he quietly followed me from the back. We did not speak about what I saw back on the burial ground till we got back to our lodge that evening. Slowly, Damon asked me what happened back in the forest that made me afraid. I told him that I saw my friend standing on the burial ground and calling me to her. She seemed sad and desperate, wanting me to follow and to be with her. Damon tried to explain that maybe it was really my friend, but I strongly denied it. I explained that my friend had food poisoning that morning and did not join the rest of us for the jungle trekking session. I knew this because I told her to take a rest in our room and told the person in charge about her condition. Damon was shocked to hear that I might have seen a spirit on the burial ground in the middle of the forest. Later that night, I couldn't sleep at all even with the lights on in my room, thinking about the creepy incident. I did not want to freak out my friend, so I did not tell her anything that happened. The next morning, when my friend woke up, she asked me if I had fun during the jungle trekking, and I told her since Damon was there, I had fun. She then asked me if I found any burial ground in the middle of the forest while we explored the jungle. I was taken aback, and I had goosebumps when I heard my friend ask me about the burial ground. I asked her how she knew about the burial ground, and she narrated the dream that she had while she slept in our room due to food poisoning. She narrated the exact time, spot, and how I reacted to seeing her in her dream. I told her that her dream was real, and I found the burial ground and saw her calling me to be with her. My friend froze, and a shiver ran down her spine immediately when she heard this from me. Now that we know that an odd and mysterious event has started to occur, we realize that we have to endure another day of our camping session. We do not know what else is in store for us, but we hope that we will come back home in one piece safely. My boyfriend at the time lived in a village that was surrounded by woodlands pretty much on every side. Anyway, one late summer afternoon he took me to see this white crumbling altar type thing. It seemed to be a really odd place to be in and seemed out of sorts, and casually told me that the rumor around the village was that devil worshipping used to occur there. I was one of those youths who was a little bit cocky and self-assured and had a no-nonsense type of outlook, who thought that people who believed in ghosts or anything like that were either attention seekers or just idiots for believing in that sort of rubbish. Anyway, as the sunlight started to fade, I said we ought to make a move, and just as we were casually walking along, boyfriend was on the right side of me, holding hands and just talking. I heard footsteps on my left-hand side. I asked if he heard that because they were quite loud, and he said that he had, and his face was showing pure fear. He was quite a tall, well-built lad and not the type to easily scare. As we stopped, the footsteps seemed to be mimicking ours, and then I started to freak out and started running, and I can still hear these footsteps at the side of me copying mine. I had ruled out that it wasn't some sort of echo or anything, so I desperately looked around, hoping it was some sort of animal or something, just so I could satisfy myself that it wasn't anything supernatural or something along those lines, but I couldn't see anything around at all. I was absolutely terrified by that point and was running on pure adrenaline, and we just ran for our lives because we were that terrified. I had that feeling when your blood drains and you feel so weak and shaky with fright. I was shaking for hours afterwards. I've never stepped foot in a woods since, and I never will. So this happened a couple of years ago, March 24, 2022. I was 16 and had just gotten my license, My friend's family was going on a day trip to the beach, Pacific City, Oregon, and a few of our friends decided that since I just got my license and a new-to-me car, we should load up in my old 300ZX, take the T-tops off, and go for a nice trip to the coast. All was going well other than the discomfort of 4 guys crammed into a small coupe on a 2-hour drive. We eventually made it to the coast and had a good day. After we had packed up our things and started to head home, my friend suggested we take a road he knew, Nestucca Access Road. For anyone familiar with the Tillamook Forest, back home instead of the main highway. It would take about an extra 45 to 60 minutes, but he said it was pretty and would be a nice change in scenery, so I obliged. The sun was setting, and in the thick forest, it got dark quick, and before we knew it, there was no cell service, no houses, and absolutely no cars, which is pretty typical for the mountain ranges between the Oregon coast and the Portland metro area, so it wasn't anything I was worrying about. After about 10 more miles, I saw a green SUV, either a Dodge Durango or Ford Escape early 2000s models, hauling a fifth wheel that crashed off the side of the road. Being that no one was around, I decided we should pull over and see if everyone was okay and offer any help we could. It was probably 8 to 10 feet off the road on a slope, only caught by the trees it had hit, and the fifth wheel was absolutely trashed. Both of the side walls were caved in with the contents of the RV spilled all along the side of the drop-off. The SUV was filled with clothes and food wrappers, almost all of the windows were shattered, and there were some pretty significant blood stains on what was left of the driver door glass and the windshield, but it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary for how bad the crash was. There was no one in or near the car, and a truck had stopped by us, and we told him we didn't see anyone and that we would just be on our way, so he kept driving, and shortly after, we started our journey back on the road. We had to go pretty slowly, as the condition of the road was getting worse and worse with massive potholes and cracks, and it definitely was not intended for lower cars. I'd say about 3 to 5 miles after the crash site, there was a pretty sharp right-hand turn with a pullover area on the apex of the turn. As my dim headlights lit up the trees behind the pull-off, I saw what looked like a pale man with saggy skin. From what I could tell was fully naked but was sort of behind some tall grass/shrubs, so I could really only see up to the bottom of its stomach. It had no hair and was kind of scrunched over, like how you would imagine an old man hunched over, just staring at my car. It didn't have prominent features, but the biggest part I remember is its eyes reflected my headlights bright like a cat's eyes and with its whole body turned to keep looking at the car as we drove by. I didn't know what to do or what to think, and my friends in the car were all staring behind us and claimed that it kind of leaned out of the shrubs to watch us drive off. We were all freaked out, and we were discussing what we just saw, whether we thought it was some tweaker that had crashed his car and just walked off or if it was some paranormal creature. I kind of played it off as the first option, but the more I thought about it, it seemed like something you'd see in a liminal space or a bad AI-generated image. No eyebrows, no hair, pale white saggy skin like when a person loses hundreds of pounds in a small amount of time, except it was saggy on its cheeks and neck and arms, etc., but seemed scrawny and frail. We sped home, and I kind of just told people the story when the subject of paranormal experiences came up. About July of 2023, my at the time girlfriend's brother and I were pretty close, and so he, his friend, and I were up driving through the trails of Dixie Mountain, talking ghost stories and such when I told them this story. Her brother's friend said he'd seen the same crash and showed me a picture of the same SUV I saw, but he said he didn't see anything creepy. I don't know what I saw or what happened, but it definitely scared me and my friends, and I've never been back on that road since that day. Maybe someone's seen something similar or had a similar experience in the Oregon wilderness? I hadn't thought about posting my story until today when my partner and I were reading a book about cryptozoology and mythological creatures, and it made me think of that story. Thanks for listening. I don't know what I encountered while camping this summer. I'm super experienced with extreme rugged camping. I avoid cold at all costs, it's not my cup of tea, but I adore heat and ruggedness. I ride a quad, usually to remote locations. Often cowboy camp. Literally just face down in the mud/dirt/sand, you name it, etc., occasionally. This year I ventured out. Found an off-grid site that had an old iron trash can as a fire pit and a picnic table. Middle of nowhere. About 10 minutes go by after I shut the quad off. I begin hearing these odd screaming sounds with reverb off in the far southeast distance of my position, moving northeast. Didn't think much of it at all, firstly. Thought some fired up riders were passing through or something is quite common. It being a Tuesday, though, I barely saw anybody out there the entire week until Friday. I do not scare easily at all. Finally noticed it getting closer and closer to me. That's when I started rolling film. It sounded like a male adult primally screaming in dying agony, some type of creature, and either an adult female screaming or a small child screaming, all at once with reverb. The way the sound was bouncing through the trees was downright bizarre. No echo I've ever really heard in my life in the woods or anywhere really. It all suddenly phased into sounding like it was completely surrounding all around me at this point a few yards beyond the tree line. Imagine hearing screaming in a specific direction, and it suddenly clicks to sounding like it's all around you. It all suddenly halts. I then hear semi-unintelligible words screaming from the male with reverb in the northwest of my location. The female/little child screams back from the same location. More word screaming commenced as some other rider came up chasing after it for whatever reason. I halted the guy on the bike, and he said he had no idea what it was but was following it to try and see what it was. No clue how he even came across whatever this was. It began moving quickly off in the distance again, and the rider took off immediately thereafter. No clue what the hell it was personally or why the guy was even trying to see what it was. Never heard anything like this in my entire life of camping/riding, and I have completed hundreds of excursions at this point. Was never spooked for some odd reason either through the entire experience. Looking back, I sure as shite should have been, no doubt at all. But for some reason, I just simply listened and recorded. I've listened to the recording a million times over, and I still have zero clue. At all. The state I was in is known for Wolfman and other cryptids, if one believes in folklore as such, I suppose. I've never encountered any creatures eyes on in my life, so I can't say personally if they exist or not. I don't dismiss anything, as it can't be totally ruled out. Life is mysterious in general, so I stay open-minded. I simply have absolutely zero clue what I encountered that night, and it's still driving me nuts. Anyone out there think this is drunkards or something? Just for reference, because this has been stated in another post, no mountain lions exist in the state I was in. The possibility of mountain lions being rogue can't be ruled out, obviously. But I don't think they speak English lol, or at least what resembled English to me in the experience and video. I even recently returned and took a trip back to the same exact location. Passed out in the dirt/sand for a few and awoken around 11:20 p.m. Didn't feel like camping there a full night again because I wanted to explore new locations to camp, so I ended up taking off. Which I am in the process of making another video of that trip, but it's nothing spectacular by any means. No occurrences took place at all. Barely even any wildlife for the 3 days I was out there. Anyone out there want to take a stab at what this could be? Because I'm clueless. Like I said, I don't scare easily at all. In the moment, I even remember at one point I thought, should I scream back? I was curious to see what would happen, but common sense prevented me from doing so, as I had no idea what I was dealing with. Still 50-50 kicking myself for lol. Wasn't spooked at all in the moment, but now. Every single time I listen to these sounds, my hair stands like static. A few summers back, I worked at a camp that was nearly 100 years old. The camp served adults and kids with varying levels of ability at all ages and was really the highlight of many of the campers' lives. Campers and workers alike joked the place was haunted, but I had thought it was one of those funny camp legends to mess with the campers and share around the fire. As a camp leader, I had my own room in an old cabin, and I shared a bathroom with one other leader who lived on the other separate half of the cabin. One night, I stayed up late managing a camper who was experiencing a meltdown. Around midnight, I had finally gotten her to sleep, and I was trekking back to my own cabin when thunder roared loudly. I sprinted the rest of the way, and as soon as I hit the door, it started pouring. I realized at this moment that I still had my walkie-talkie on me. Usually we charge them in the main office at night, but I decided to not run into the storm, so I turned the walkie-talkie off and set it on my dresser. Shortly after that, I went to bed. I awoke at around 3 a.m. to what felt like someone poking my leg. I was really confused by the sensation. I opened my eyes and looked down at my leg under the sheet where I had felt the poke and saw nothing. I tried to go back to sleep, but a few seconds later I felt it more aggressively and on a larger scale, as if a whole hand had wrapped around my calf, and I sat up in fear. As I sat up, my walkie-talkie across the room lit up and beeped, something that could only happen if someone physically turned the side dial and pressed a button. The walkie-talkie stayed on, and I was paralyzed in fear. Eventually I got up and turned it back off and turned on the room's lights. I checked, and no one was in my room or under my bed or in my closet. There were no objects that could have caused the poking. To this day, it still makes me feel tight-chested thinking about it. Something's going on in my local woods. Alright, this is a long, poorly written one, boys, but I need help to possibly solve this mystery. I'd be happy to answer questions and possibly go back to the site, but I'm taking a trip soon, so I don't know when that'll be. I took my pellet gun out into the woods down a service road about 45 minutes from my house. It was about 12 to 2ish, so fairly early. I spent a bit of time in the woods and then continued on the service road, making note of or walking up some of the paths/ATV trails. Near the end of the road, at the time I didn't know what it was, but anyway. I saw a pallet in a ditch with a beaten down path behind it, so I started to make my way down. I figured maybe a campsite where teenagers drank or something. This bit of woods was fairly weird. It was really dark and just sort of not quite like the rest, very mossy and damp, whereas the rest was fairly dried up or regular. Well, about 5 feet into the trail, I could see some containers on the ground and a fair few up ahead. I took a look, and it was hair dye along with a few spray cans. Some I could see were hairspray, others were too rusted. I made my way up to the area that I could see more containers, and there was an area of elevated moss, the highest area about 2, maybe 2.5 feet off the ground, the lowest of like 1/4 a foot. I could see a green or brown jacket hanging out of the moss. I lifted it up a bit and saw a button and a tag. Around me there must have been at least 20 bottles of dye, almost all of the same brand, some I couldn't check because they looked to have been out there some time. I left almost as quickly as I came and asked my parent if I should alert the police. Of course, they didn't have too clear a picture of what I was on about and figured it was nothing. I wasn't quick to jump to conclusions either. I mean, it wasn't that odd, but definitely strange. Next day, about 8 a.m. to 10 Amish. I thought I'd record it just to have something to share or somewhere, but I couldn't find anywhere. I found 2 split-off trails with clothes buried in moss, hair dye, and garbage bags all around. Something called thermalizer, equalizer, and loricide. About 2 jugs of loricide. Now things were getting weird. After about 10 minutes, I decided to leave again because I thought I had heard something in the woods. I wasn't that panicked, but I wasn't going to stick around to see if I should be. 2 days after the last visit, around say 5 to 7 p.m. The third day I decided I was bringing 2 friends under the guise of us just shooting in the woods, and we were getting to the bottom of this. We went in a little earlier on the trail this time because my friend had wandered off to look at some garbage someone had thrown into the woods, and I recognized it and said that's close to the mystery, as I called it. I showed them some of the stuff I had found, and we looked around. We found 2 coffee cups no older than a few days in different areas. That reminded me there was a McDonald's cup there older than me. I'd never seen the design before. More loricide dye and clothes all through the woods spaced out decently, say about 10 feet at the shortest distance. There were close scrapes in between, but the ones you could see buried were a fair distance. I'm not giving a great timeline because this happened yesterday and I just woke up, so it's hard to remember, but it's not really relevant. We planned on leaving probably 5 times, but every time we'd find something more to look at. On our way out one time, I found that the first mound I found had had its side torn up very recently. Half of it was torn to shreds, but there were 2 distinct holes in it deeper than the rest. So we looked more, finding yet more clothes, some seeming much more recent. One looking like it hadn't been so much as rained on. Then we found probably about 15 to 20 jugs of loricide deep in the woods, about a 5-minute walk off of the service road, whereas the majority of stuff we found was about 5 meters from the road. We found areas of sunken ground where the leaves looked to be bluish. And on the way out, here's the real kicker. We found 4 roughly 20, maybe 30-pound fish gutted, sitting next to a box cutter, and I mean these cocksuckers were big, like store-bought bugs. Lying right off the entrance with the wood in the ditch. They couldn't have been there for a night because the wolves would have gotten them something, anything. No, those were placed there that day. After a little more searching around, we got the hell out of there. Needless to say, I'm currently trying to think of new places to shoot my pellet gun. This happened in 2022. I am someone who is into witchcraft, but I was still a beginner. I, my mom, and my aunt decided to hike together next to a forest. While they were talking with each other, I was looking at the trees around me, and then I saw this butterfly flying next to me, kind of parallel to me. It was really looking like those big butterflies. The thing is, the wings were shining. As if the light reflected on the wings or it had its own light. It was a white/rainbow color. I was mesmerized looking at it because I had never seen such a thing like that. Seconds later, the butterfly just went into the woods, and I couldn't see it anymore. After this hypnotizing moment, I asked my mom if she saw it, but she didn't. At first, I didn't understand why someone wouldn't notice that thing that was literally shining. So I have only myself as a witness. I thought that could be just an insect. I didn't think about fairies. Then I tried to search for something closer to what I saw, and I just can't find anything. I only see people that saw fairies before saying almost the same thing that I experienced. I saw the shining wings, but I couldn't go too close to it, I was afraid to scare the bug. So, has anyone experienced something similar? Or do you know any butterflies that can get an optical illusion like that? At this point, I just believed that I saw a fairy. Out back in the woods. So this story takes place in southeast Texas within 100 miles of Houston. I was in college but had moved back in with my parents for a semester after some roommate drama. My parents live out in the country, miles outside of town with some acreage. The land at the back of the house consists of 4 zones, really. You got the backyard with the nice St. Augustine, the back, which is a section of woods my parents cleared of underbrush and kept fairly maintained, the back, which is a clearing we used to go back and do bonfires and parties in high school, and then the woods. After high school, my parents kind of gave up on keeping back the brush and weeds from anything except their nice backyard section. So imagine a big backyard fenced by a wall of tall weeds and large trees that goes back a while, and then a field of giant weeds transitioning into solid dense woods with oak, some pine, yaupon, and briar and all that. I also had this dog that my parents let me keep outside. They had a big chain-link dog run she lived in since my parent had no perimeter fencing besides some barbed wire at the very back of the property, and this dog was not the type to stay in one spot. In fact, she was aggressive to other dogs, always going after them and acting tough, and I sometimes worried she'd get out and kill the neighbor's chickens. She was about 60 pounds and not a jumpy or scared dog. Since I was in college, I had no curfew or anything and would always come home late at night/early morning after hanging out with friends or studying or whatnot. On this particular night it was pretty cold out, 50 degrees is cold, can't tell me different, and even though she had a house and a bed and straw out there, I felt bad for my dog, so I decided to bring her in to sleep in the garage. I should have been more careful because this happened quite a bit, but somehow this dog always got me. She would wait in the back until the gate was unlocked, and I was in the run, gate closed with unlocked horseshoe latch, run around me, pop the gate latch with her nose, and bolt off. So of course she did this, and my dumb ass was left standing in the run in the cold in the middle of the night. I was pissed because I knew I had to go find her and bring her back. The moon was pretty bright, and I had seen her fly into the weed wall and disappear, so I followed her in without a light, calling her name. There were some little trails through the weeds that we tried to keep open so we could access the property, but these were less wide than a person could walk, and the weeds were about a head taller than me, so it was dense. Anyway, I'd gone a ways and had passed through the wooded section out into the clearing, solid weeds 5 to 8 feet tall, and I got quiet listening, trying to hear sounds of where she might be out there when I heard intermittent rustling out toward the woods, which at this point are just a real tall dark outline at the edge of the weed jungle. The rustling wasn't the sound I expected since she usually just crashed through the woods. In my head I'm thinking, what the hell is she doing now? Honestly thought she was probably rolling around in some dead skunk, and I was going to have to bathe her. Figuring it was my wild-ass dog, I make my way toward the noise, calling out her name again. As I got closer, it became apparent the rustling was not the sound of an animal charging through underbrush but more like something intentionally shaking the trees. Like if you would grab a yaupon branch and shake it, all the connected trees and vines would shake too. I was close enough now to make out individual branches silhouetted at the top of the tree line, and I could see that whatever was going on was causing the trees to shake all the way up to the top. This was off, and decidedly not my dog prancing around. I shut up and froze. I hear in all these stories people talking about how when they notice the woods go silent. I can't remember if this happened or not, but as I stood there, I clearly heard 2 or 3 loud, deep huffs. I guess it kind of sounded like a bull but with a deeper fluttering to it, not like the tonal sounds a cow makes but the deep heavy exhale when they're defensive, and seemed to come from around my head height. For some reason my mind registered that this thing was a lot closer to me than the tree line. I also remember the distinct feeling that this noise was directed at me. I got this terrible feeling in my gut, like whole-body fear and panic. Rational or not, I yelled my dog's name with all fear and urgency, you know how your voice gets higher and louder at the end, and turned and ran as hard as I could. Either my dog heard my tone and got scared, or she was scared of whatever was on that tree line too because as I crashed through the weeds, she came up on my left from a creek and flew past me like a bullet. When I got to the open garage, she was trying to get in the back door to the house, jumping on it like a crazy animal. I closed the garage, put her in her kennel, and went to bed. I don't know what it was, and at the time I convinced myself it was one of those hogzillas you hear about on the news. I've been around plenty of cattle and have never heard one make a noise quite like this. Not saying it couldn't have been, but something just didn't feel right. This was like 10 years ago, but I know for sure I'm still going to think real hard about it if I ever have to go back out there alone at night. I am a native of Southwest Virginia. I live about an hour from the border of TN, WV, and NC. I will say there's a lot of trauma in these Appalachian hills, and with the generational trauma also comes generations of folklore and superstitions, most carrying over from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Germany. Some also crossed over with Cherokee and African legend. I moved to a rural community that was much like my own childhood community, in a valley, about 25 minutes away from the nearest highway or basic infrastructure. No cell service. Well, after talking to neighbors here for the last few years, there have been repeated stories about folks being visited by or disrupted by a hellhound of sorts, a black wolf spirit with red eyes. Looking into it, this legend in itself has earlier roots in Welsh legend about a black shuck, which back in those days they would bury a trusty hound under their churches for good luck. There's also a large system of caves in these hills, and my childhood best friend, who lives down the road, her grandpa always told us to not play near those caves. So we respect the land. When I forage, I leave a gift and blessing. Also, we grew up closing our blinds at night. Never looking outside because we could be spied on without noticing. To this day I get paranoia at night if I don't close my blinds. I grew up in a haunted house. There were repeated haunts that would happen at the same time each day. But the most uncanny phenomenon I ever experienced was what I called fairy lights. They were large balls of light that pulsated in the trees like a gentle heartbeat and moved about as if they had their own life to them. I'd see them periodically in the yard or out in the woods at night. My name is Isabel, and I live in the Pacific Northwest, in the great, green state of Washington, to be exact. One of my New Year's resolutions for 2020 was to lose the extra weight I had accumulated during my first pregnancy, weight that had sapped my confidence and left me feeling kind of dumpy. My husband always told me he didn't mind, that he loved me no matter what, but I minded. It might sound a little tradwife of me, but I want to look my best for him, just like he looks his best for me. But the trouble is, I've never, ever enjoyed that vibe that seems to hang in the air at co-ed gyms. Some places have members that seem to care only about hooking up or ogling each other, while some female-only gyms are so underfunded that they just aren't worth going to. So, I took up hiking. I always figured the outdoors would be excellent for my mental health, and I'd gone for walks in the woods as part of fighting off the postnatal depression, which were very effective at doing so. I remember how excited I was, driving out to a sporting goods store to pick up a snug pair of hiking boots, along with a lot of colorful waterproof gear, mostly in lilac, my favorite color. It felt like the start of something wonderful. I was already sharing, asking for advice on specialist hiking gear, and I could not wait to report back on my progress. But my first serious solo hike in the woods was set to be anything but relaxing or uplifting, and it left me with a greater respect for nature's wraith than I ever thought was possible. My husband and I arranged for him to look after the baby while I drove out to Olympic National Forest for an afternoon of hiking. All went swimmingly for about an hour or two, as I pushed myself up hills, feeling my thighs burning, then trembling when they felt the relief of a downslope. It felt amazing, exhilarating, truly uplifting, at least, until I took a tumble. I think my boot caught a rock or something hidden among the earth, but whatever happened, I found myself rolling around in the dirt beneath me, holding onto my ankle as I grimaced in pain. I found I could still put a little weight on it, so it couldn't have been worse than a strain, but it still hurt like the devil. That's when the strangest, most adorable thing happened to me. A crow, a little cawing, black feathered guy, flew down from a tree, landed on a tree stump nearby, and began to flap his wings. He was doing little jumps, flapping all the while, cawing his little head off like he was singing for his supper. He had seen me take a fall and was flying down to see if I was okay. I mean, that's what it seemed like, because as soon as I said, yeah, I'm fine, just scared myself is all, he quieted down and began eyeing me with each of the tiny, black pebbles set into his skull. With my ankle still aching a little, I picked myself up, said goodbye to my new crow buddy, and then began to limp back towards my car. What happened next seemed like the sweetest thing ever. My new little crow buddy actually followed me. Yep, he followed me so close too, just making sure I was okay as I was shuffling back to my car. He flew from tree to tree, always sticking close, cawing every so often, just to let me know he was still there to watch over me. It was honestly such a boost. The fall has really rocked my confidence, and to know that nature had its own way of being so kind, so compassionate, it really picked me up at a time I absolutely needed it. However, it wasn't long until my ankle began to really swell up from the sprain. And obviously, with the swelling came an increased amount of pain. Now, I know this might sound crazy, but that intense pain and my inability to properly escape it brought back the memories of childbirth, and as I sat there on a fallen log, taking the weight off of my ankle, I found myself bursting into tears. And just like something out of a Disney movie, down swooped my little crow friend, who began his same little song and dance of concern. It made my heart swell at the time, it really did. It really was like a Disney story or something, the crying princess and her little bird friend. But then, in what I thought was a beautiful moment, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Something was moving through the trees about 100 yards up the slope, something huge, something that drooled when it saw me sitting on that fallen log. It was a grizzly bear, fresh out of hibernation, and it was starving. What I thought was my little crow friend began its song and dance again, only this time, it was intensely more frenzied than it had been before. I thought it was a warning, I couldn't have been more wrong. The bear began a rapid descent down the slope towards me, panting as it hurtled through the trees. But I was ready for it. I'd managed to pick up the most potent bear mace I could get my hands on, one of the things my new hiking buddies had insisted I purchase. I pulled it out, flipped off the safety catch, and sprayed a huge mist of bright yellow mace into the air in front of me. I was terrified, convinced that it just wouldn't work for some reason, that the bear would just be too damned hungry, would take the pain, and tear me limb from limb right there on the forest floor. But it worked, it actually worked. As soon as the grizzly hit that stinging yellow mist, it stopped dead in its tracks, blinking its eyes before it began to violently sneeze and retch as the mace began to take effect. I didn't bother to stick around and revel in the victory, I mean, who would? I just ran until my ankle felt like it was about to explode, but, thankfully, some small act of God's mercy led me right back to my car. And somehow, I actually made it home. I lived to be able to tell this tale. But when I did a little research. What I thought was my little crow friend, what had seemed like a Disney-style friendship between Beauty and Beast, was anything but that. As it turns out, crows and bears have something of a special relationship. Often, upon sighting a wounded or infirm animal, a crow will fly down from a tree and caw like the devil. Not out of any kind of concern, but in order to direct a large predator, often a bear, onto the wounded creature. Once the bear has finished chowing down, the crow can eat the scraps. And that day in the woods could have very well ended with me being the scraps. I had this experience when I was around 11 years old, and I still vividly remember it all these decades later. I grew up in Miami, and my mom and stepdad used to like going to the Redlands to browse and purchase produce and plants, as there were many farmers markets and nurseries in that area back then. In the 80s, the Redlands were undeveloped and very rural. The Miccosukee Indian village was nearby, along with the Everglades, so there was a lot of land out there. Most of it is uninhabited and unexplored. Since I was just a kid, I didn't care about fresh produce or native plants, so I did not look forward to spending an entire Saturday browsing strawberries and succulents. For this reason, my parents usually let me spend the day with their friends, who lived in the area and had a daughter my age. Their house was in the middle of nowhere and perfect for exploring. This family liked to live on their own land. The farmer grew fresh corn and made tamales with it, which he sold at the local farmers markets. The daughter was a free spirit, and her parents seemed to nurture that trait, while I was introverted and pretty sheltered. I felt this made us the perfect match, so we were good friends. I usually lost my inhibitions while with her, so I always had a lot of fun. For this visit, I had even brought a book with me from the school library about a family who explored Florida together, which I wanted to share with her. Maybe we could find some of the animals and plants they saw. That Saturday we set off exploring our usual haunts after watching some Saturday morning cartoons together. We were going to go to our favorite tree and then a bit further along to a canal. If we were lucky, we would get to see some turtles and sandhill cranes. If we were really lucky, we would get to see a gator. Armed only with a stick to ward off any snakes, we set out on our adventure, watching our steps and keeping away from the tall grass. The tree we loved, which we had made some carvings on, was in a clearing. Behind that clearing was nothing but thick, dense woods, and they spread out for miles. Well, actually in Florida, woods don't really look like the ones Little Red Riding Hood would skip in. You can't stroll through them unless you have a machete. It's more like an impenetrable jungle than woods. We never dared go in them or even get too close. Sometimes what looked like solid ground was really water, and where there's water, there's gators. Miles into that jungle would be the Miccosukee Indian village. We didn't know in which direction exactly or how far, but it was out there. In there. The vastness of the terrain was mind-boggling, and I kind of lagged behind, mesmerized by it, as my friend told me she was headed to the canal. As I looked into the dense foliage, wondering about the village and where exactly it would be, I suddenly saw something that wasn't possible. It was a man, for lack of a better word, well, more like a man covered in hair from head to toe. I just stood there blinking rapidly and completely dumbfounded at what I was seeing. My mind turned as it tried to make sense of it. The man was just standing there, looking straight at me. He could see me, just as I could see him. I never saw where he came from or how long he had been watching me. He was too far off to make out facial features, but I could see his arms were very long, and he was large. His hands almost reaching to his knees. His size is why I had assumed it was a man. He stood completely upright. I can still remember vividly the reddish-brown hair he was covered with. It was long and definitely not fur. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I kept staring at him, trying to understand what my eyes saw, but my mind wouldn't accept. He then turned to the side as if he was going to walk into the bushes. It appeared he didn't want anything to do with me now that I had seen him. The confusion, surrealness, and curiosity dropped from me like a rock off the edge of a cliff and was suddenly replaced by primal fear. I had never felt that kind of terror before. An ancient instinct kicked in, which prevented me from screaming. That thing had already seen me, so I didn't want it to also hear me. That's when I ran. I ran like the devil was after me until I caught up to my friend. It wasn't a long run. She hadn't gotten very far at all. She wasn't going to leave me far behind, as we knew to always stick together out here. When she saw me, she looked alarmed at how frantic I was and asked me what happened. When I didn't reply but kept looking back to where I had run from instead, she asked me if it had been a raccoon. An armadillo? A fox? An osprey? Oh shit, a bear? Her giddy excitement increased with each animal until she was clapping her hands together and jumping up and down. She asked me where it was. She wanted to see it too. As she turned around to go back, I immediately stopped her. She looked at me surprised, but I was still at a loss for words. All I could say to her was, "Don't, please." She stared at me for an explanation, but I didn't know how to explain to her what I had seen. I couldn't even begin to describe it, so I just told her that I had just seen Chewbacca. She continued to stare at me, not understanding and now with her mouth open. When she didn't respond, I told her that we had to get out of here. She continued staring at me, with confusion on her face. Then she broke out in hysterical laughter. She really thought I was joking. I told her, almost crying, that I had really just seen Chewbacca, for real. She stopped laughing when she saw how serious I was and the terror in my eyes. That's when she kind of waved me off and told me that I couldn't have seen Chewbacca. He's not real, and besides, if he were, he would be out in space, not out in the Florida jungle. I asked her what it was then. It looked just like Chewbacca. Well, I mean, not exactly. Now that I was sounding doubtful, it reinforced her skepticism, and she told me it was probably a bear. I knew there were black bears in Florida, but that's not what I had seen. I told her it wasn't a bear. I know what black bears look like, and this thing was standing up like a man. It wasn't even black. It wasn't doing anything bears do. It was different. It was smart. I was glad she didn't ask me what I meant by that because I didn't know myself. Instead, she stayed quiet for a bit as she looked down at her shoes. I knew that she didn't believe me, but I noticed that she wasn't trying to head back there anymore either. I could see her mind working. She was trying to find an explanation where there wasn't one. That's when she told me in a hesitant voice that maybe it had been a monkey. People have released pet monkeys in Florida, and they have thrived out in the wild. Before I could tell her it was too big to be a monkey, she found a much better explanation. She blurted out, much more confidently, that it had to have been some guy dressed up in a costume. I could see the relief on her face from just saying this out loud. I have to admit, that explanation calmed me down a bit too, even though I couldn't imagine some guy, all alone, in 90-degree heat with 80% humidity, in the middle of nowhere while wearing a full costume. This wasn't a picnic area or a tourist place for him to scare or prank anyone. No one was out here. Literally. No one even came fishing or camping out this way. Besides, if there really was a prankster out there in a costume, why hadn't he come towards me or followed us in order to complete the joke? He could have at least waved at me, just to make me crap my pants. Instead, he just stared at me and then sort of slipped back into those bushes. Into nowhere. Even though I couldn't find the logic in it being some guy celebrating Halloween early, what was the alternative? I had to accept it or go crazy. It at least gave me a little hope that I hadn't lost my mind completely. I told my friend we should just go back to her house then. If some weirdo was out here in a costume, maybe we shouldn't be out here with him. I remembered that a year before, while celebrating a birthday party in a park, a weirdo had exposed himself to her, and the police had been called. So she quickly agreed to go back because now she was spooked herself, even though she wouldn't admit it. As we headed back, she told me she was glad that guy hadn't worn a clown costume, or I would have had a heart attack. I knew she wanted to be a comedian when she grew up, but I didn't laugh at her joke this time. I had almost had a heart attack. My mind couldn't stop reeling for an explanation for what I had seen. Whatever it was, it didn't follow us, and I never saw it again. It was gone. We thankfully never talked about it again either. I never mentioned it to my parents, and I was grateful she didn't mention it to hers. I was hoping she would forget it, and she did. I didn't want to have to explain what I saw again to someone else, especially an adult. No one would understand or believe it. I wished she wouldn't have gone towards the canal so soon so she would have seen it too. Then she would have really understood. I never wanted to go out exploring anymore when I visited her. Instead, I liked to stay close enough to where we could always see her house in the distance. She seemed to prefer it that way too. The experience left me doubting my own sanity for a while. Had I hallucinated it? What had I seen? Had it really been a man in a costume? If it was, that was one expensive and realistic costume. Seemed crazy to use it out in the middle of nowhere instead of at a party or event. How did he make his arms so long? What was he doing out there? This haunted me for a long time until many years later, when I saw a TV show that talked about Bigfoot-like creatures in Florida. The Seminole tribe believed these creatures had always roamed these lands because their people had always seen them. The creatures are referred to as skunk ape or skunky because of their unpleasant odor. I had been too far away from the thing I had seen to have smelled anything emanating from it, but what they described is exactly what I had seen. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't believe it. It had been real. I had locked eyes with it. I knew I had seen a real thing that I just couldn't explain. I didn't get much relief knowing this information, though. I think I would have preferred to find out it really had been a man in a costume after all. The Seminoles believe the creatures are peaceful and non-threatening, but I just can't shake off that it had been watching me. It hadn't just seen me like an animal would have. It had been watching. Again, it was smart. When I travel through Florida, I always look into that dense jungle and wonder what's out there, in all that unexplored land. What could be looking back at me? I've had plenty of weird experiences, but I believe the only definitive thin place experience I've had was at Canyonlands in Utah last year. It was a red full moon. I think smoke was making it red, I can't remember, but it was also cloudy, and moonlight was hardly shining through. My GF and I had decided for whatever reason to head up from Moab to Canyonlands starting at like 7:30 p.m., early October, so the sun was on its way down. The sky was purple, hardly anyone was on the roads heading up, but plenty heading back out, and it got pitch dark during our 45-minute drive. Both of us had a very strong sense of we should probably not be heading up here at night and didn't share that with each other so as to not freak each other out. In fact, we both had a sense of that before we even left the restaurant we'd eaten dinner at just beforehand. Foolishly, I felt like that was just me psyching myself out, because I had a strong connection to the particular location we were going, Mesa Arch, from years ago. Long story short, in 2016 it was at Mesa Arch that I discovered a sense of connection with the earth and the stories I wanted to tell as an author that I still can't put into words, and it was a very special experience that greatly influenced me and still does. So, in my mind heading up there that night, I was thinking of it as a pilgrimage to a wonderful place. Of course it would be safe at any hour, right? We got up to the parking lot, and there was one car packing up. There was no one else visible anywhere. No other lights at any other location we could see, not just our parking lot. The eerie feeling only got stronger, and weirdly, it felt like we were not alone out there, even when the single car left. Trying to keep a positive attitude and not let fear prevent us from doing something we'd been excited to do, we grabbed our stuff and headed out. The Mesa Arch Trail is like, maybe half a mile long, if not less. We were going to sit in the silence and enjoy the aura the place has during the day, which is already strong enough. This is where it gets weird. Walking along, it instinctually felt like we needed to be quiet so as to not alert anything to our presence. It truly felt like we weren't supposed to be there at that time. To note, it definitely doesn't feel that way during the day, even if hardly anyone is there. It was pitch black, we could hardly see, and when I turned on a little lamp to even be able to see our feet, my girlfriend quickly suggested I turn it off so as to not freak ourselves out by casting shadows. She later said she actually just wanted to not put a spotlight on us by saying, "Here we are." Now, my GF has night hiked solo many times before we met, and luckily now knows that that was pretty foolish and doesn't do it anymore. Still, she always has the attitude of confidence outdoors, saying things like bears are in this area, but we're not going to run into any, etc., and oh, nothing is going to happen. She was doing a good job of not appearing scared, and I could sort of tell she was, at least a little. So I turned my lamp off. We'd been vlogging our trip so far, and we were trying to then, even though, of course, there was nothing to see. Us softly talking to our phone was, we discussed later, more to show that we were there with appreciative and respectful intentions. Who were we showing that to? Who knows? But the sense was extremely strong that we needed to do that. Again, this is without actually speaking out on our worries, and both arrived at independently. It felt like at each step I had to look side to side and behind me. Once or twice I swear I saw movement, but it was probably the motion of my head turning to a stationary bush. The dead bushes and junipers and their spindly branches didn't help with this, ha! There came a point in the trail where you could go left or right, pretty much at right angles from the trail to that point so far. Either way you went, you'd descend into a bowl area of sorts, getting closer to the arch itself and a huge drop-off. The bowl is definitely where the aura in the daytime is strongest, as well. We both reached this intersection and stopped immediately, at the same exact time without saying anything to cause the other to stop. We both just stopped in perfect sync. It felt like an invisible wall, seriously. It felt stronger than anything that we were intruding on a congregation. That's the best I can describe it. It was a very particular feeling, and I've never felt it before or since. I've had the being watched feeling many times, the sense of dread, the sense of not being alone, etc., many times. This was the only time where it felt, very specifically, that we were not welcome and that there was a group of somebodies that were down there in the bowl who were having a meeting of some sort, and we had reached the threshold to intrude or go away. At the same time, lol, we said, "Do you want to go back?" And quickly turned around. We both knew it would probably be bad to proceed. Also weirdly, we both had the unspoken sense of needing to not run back to the car but to show that we were chill. Again, not sure why. It's like we didn't want to trigger a predator instinct in anything, which I have also felt strongly before in a much different situation, but also to show our respect or something. I don't know. I swear I saw movement in the bushes again once on the way back, but I actually doubt it was anything. We heard a large pack of coyotes across the way. This was the opposite direction of where we were fleeing from and sounded perhaps 300 yards away, give or take. We hurried back to the car, coyotes yipping en masse not too far away, total darkness surrounding us, and whatever congregation we had just narrowly avoided on the other side. Being a field recordist, I badly wanted to get some audio of the coyotes, but using my better judgment for only the second time that night, I decided against it. We got in the car and quickly got out of there. It felt like after a minute or two of speeding away, we could take a deep breath. We discussed our intuitions we both had from the restaurant all the way up to minutes before and discovered that we had had the exact same senses/feelings at every point along the way, including the oddly specific intruding on a congregation feeling, which neither of us had felt at all before. It felt like the earth itself was aware of our presence, but many other things were too, and they wanted us gone. It was the weirdest mix of sense I've ever felt, and they were very distinct from each other too. As we drove, the moon peeked behind the clouds for the first time, revealing a red, full moon that appeared oddly huge in the sky. The only thing I can think of is that there were animals/creatures in the area, not the coyotes. They were in the opposite direction, or nature spirits gathering on the full moon/supermoon. It was bigger than usual. Furthermore, this area was distinctly Navajo land. This was one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. I definitely think the veil is thin there, and the moon may have had some involvement in that as well. They're in the woods. I'm not really sure if I can call this a ghost story, to be honest, mainly because I personally was explained by these entities that they are not ghosts/spirits but were once people. This is, however, a true story that happened to me, my girlfriend, we'll call her Amy, and my stepsister, let's call her Rose. This happened when I was 13 on a summer night in July. It was dark, and I lived in a trailer park at the time in Ohio. I lived in a small town, not very small, but you get the idea, you can't find it on a lot of maps. The layout is kind of odd with two entrances, one by the center and one in the back. The trailer park is basically 3 connected loops and one going uphill with its own road. The first loop has 2 roads on what we call the hill. The farthest road up is by a small patch of woods and is the darkest part of the trailer park at night. Sometimes one of the streetlights wouldn't come on. It was by the furthest turn from the entrance and really dark at night. I lived by the center entrance in trailer 4. At the time, I and my girlfriend weren't dating, but we still hung out a lot. She lived a row down from me, but it was easy just to cut 3 yards to get to her house. Anyway, those details aren't too important, onto the story. That night, I and Amy were arguing about something pretty stupid, as teens do. Rose is a couple of years younger than me and Amy but liked to be with us anyway. We were on the hill just turning onto the darkest street when Rose decided she didn't want to deal with me and Amy arguing anymore. She sped ahead of us, and I watched her ride off. I wasn't worried since she was surprisingly smart and strong for her age. She's also pretty tall. Unfortunately, her character doesn't quite fit her build. She's pretty shy. Anyway, she went ahead of us and got to the darkest point of that street, the corner, and froze. She looked up into the woods, stared into the woods, terrified. I attempted to catch up to her, but before I could get to her, she turned and took off on her scooter. I stopped and waited for Amy to catch up. Of course she yelled at me for running like that. She thought I was trying to ditch her. I apologized and claimed I wanted to ask Rose why she went ahead of us. I knew if I told her about Rose stopping and looking in the woods, she'd want to investigate. Though I brushed it off as her getting scared of a shadow, I couldn't help but feel like something was watching us as we passed the area. A little while later, Amy decided to walk off to cool down. I didn't stop her. In fact, I didn't blame her. I can get pretty annoying at times. What concerned me, though, was we still hadn't seen Rose. After Amy walked off, I circled the trailer park a couple of times before I saw her. She was on the complete opposite side of the trailer park from where she took off. I ran up to her, yelling out her name. As I got closer, I realized she was close to crying. She began rambling about something in the woods and how she thought whatever it was got me and Amy. I calmed her down to explain to me what she saw. Disclaimer, bear with me here because I know people are going to be like, oh, this is fake because of what I explain, and no, I'm not making this a Slenderman story. This is what she saw, and it will not be the only spirit/person we see. Again, I'm not making a Slenderman ripoff. In fact, I still see this guy from time to time. Anyway, back to the story. She told me they had no face, just a place where sockets and a nose would be. They were tall with pale skin and an all-black suit except for the undershirt, which almost matched their skin. I was sure she was seeing things, but to make her feel better, I decided we should go back up to the woods and look. She agreed, and we made our way to the woods. Once we got back to the road, we walked silently, listening for anything in the woods. We heard nothing, but the entire time we felt we were being watched. Once we made it to the corner, we still hadn't seen or heard anything. I had her go ahead of me just in case. As I started to calm down, thinking it was nothing, I felt like someone may have been following us. When I turned around, I swear I saw what she did standing in the tree line, just staring in our direction. I felt myself begin to panic but remained calm on the outside. I told Rose to just keep moving. As we walked, I realized whatever was there was inching closer to us, coming out of the woods. They were about 7 feet tall. They didn't seem to be moving any of their body parts, they were just floating. When we turned the next corner, I told her to go as fast as she could, and I ran to keep up with her. Once we made it off the hill, we went back to our house and got inside. But once we went in, I realized Amy was still out on her own. I told Rose I was going to go find her. I tried to make her stay, but she insisted on coming with. So I let her. We found her around where I found Rose. I previously forgot to tell Rose not to tell Amy about the figure in the woods. But before I could say anything, Rose blurted out everything. Amy thought someone was messing with us and decided she was going to go into the woods to confront them on her own. I tried to talk her out of it the entire time we walked there. Of course my words didn't faze her, and she went up into the woods anyway. I yelled that I was going to walk Rose home and that I'd be back. As we walked down the hill, about halfway, I heard a distant, inhuman shriek come out of the woods. I told Rose to go home as fast as she could, and I turned back, running to see if Amy was okay. I didn't get very far before I saw her running. Mind you, this was the first time I had actually seen her scared after knowing her for 3 years, so I knew something was wrong. I stopped, and she told me to run home, so we all fled back to my house. Once we got there, we were all tired, panting, and sweaty. You should have seen how confused my mother was. She asked what was wrong, but I knew she wouldn't believe us. And even if she did, I didn't want her involved with this. So I just told her we decided to run back. We all went to my room and closed the curtains. We also turned the closet light on and closed the door. We all sat down, and I asked Amy what she saw when she was up there. She told me she saw a tall, black shadow. No legs, but they did have arms. They were about 8 feet tall, and they were carrying something large and dripping. Their backs were turned to her, so she shouted out to them. She started cursing them out and yelling. Once they turned around, though, they looked directly at her, revealing a white porcelain mask with red lips and markings above the eyes. It stretched out an empty arm, pointing at her before letting out a loud, inhuman shriek. That's when she ran out of the woods and told us to go. The rest of the night, the two beings harassed all three of us. There are 3 particular moments I remember vividly. The first was when I looked in the yard through my curtains. They both stood there, staring into the window. The second, we all went outside to look for my cat. I looked under a car for him but fell back when I saw the one without a face lying there, just staring back at me, his head tilted in a curiously twisted manner. We did eventually find him and bring him inside. The third one I didn't actually see, but Amy told me about it. She said when we came back to my room after looking, she saw a pair of feet behind my closet door. When she looked away and looked back, they were gone. After that we turned the light off and ignored the closet. I managed to convince my mom to let her stay the night that night, but we didn't sleep much. Rose ended up falling asleep around 2 in the morning, while I and Amy fell asleep on the couch together at 4:30. The next day, I, Rose, and Amy decided to go up to the woods and investigate the area. Amy saw the masked one. As we suspected, when we got there was blood on the tree the entity stood by and a trail of blood on the path leading to some bushes. For the sake of not wanting to find anything we couldn't unsee, we decided not to look in the bushes and walked out of the woods. Ever since then, these entities have been following us and communicating with us. They taught us about their meetings and stuff like that. I've attended a few but hardly remember what I did or said. But Crescent, the masked one, and Faceless, pretty self-explanatory, are not the only ones. There's also Leo, who looks like Crescent but is slightly taller, only has one eye hole in his mask, and is missing an arm, who is second in command. There's Angel, who always walks with a noose hanging around her throat. The Weeper, who's covered in bruises and cuts, slits his wrists and leaves blood and tears wherever he goes. The Puppeteer, the leader, he can control whoever he wants but gives great pain to himself and whoever is around while he takes over someone. Then there's the Executioner. If you see him, that usually means something terrible is going to happen to you or someone close to you soon. He's a tall cloaked figure, no lie, about 20 feet tall. You can't see his face, but when you see him, it's kind of creepy. Before I moved away, I was walking the trailer park pretty late, and I looked up. Across the main road that the trailer park sat beside, in a storage unit lot, I saw him standing there. I got so angry, I ran at him. Once I reached the middle of the road, he vanished completely. Then I noticed a car coming down the road, speeding. Luckily I got out of the way. A month after seeing him, my father died of cardiac arrest. The blood vessels in his heart constricted so tightly that blood couldn't flow through it, and it failed. The worst thing is, no matter what, they always find you. Not too long ago I moved away from the trailer park, but they found me. I still see Leo and Crescent around, walking in the woods or watching me. It's terrifying, I don't know what they want, but they always find me. At school, at home, at the mall, hell, they followed me to North Carolina on a vacation once. I had to stay away from my family there so they wouldn't take interest in them. I currently think that Leo is attempting to get revenge on me for calling him a one-armed bastard at a meeting. You should have seen how pissed Amy was the next time I saw her. She was like, "You're such an idiot, they're going to kill you." I brushed it off, but I don't know. I guess he's still pissed about it. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any suggestions on what I should do, please feel free to comment. Thanks for listening. My name is Amber Lee, and I live here in Asheville, North Carolina, with my dog, Captain. Captain holds a special place in my heart. He's an Alaskan Klee Kai Husky with a mostly black coat, but with streaks of white fur around his legs and face, not to mention little rings of dark fur around his pale blue eyes that make him look like the Hamburglar. I rescued him from a shelter when he was just a puppy, right after my fiancée moved out to Hong Kong for work. He helped me through the initial loneliness on nights when I just couldn't handle getting into an empty bed for the 50th time. And in the years that followed, when my husband decided he would be better off starting a family with a Chinese woman he met through his job, Captain helped me through the heartbreak. Captain is a big guy, a subwoofer. While other dogs need walks, Captain needs hikes. Which is why, every weekend for the past few years, I would drive him out to Nantahala National Forest, one of the few places he could really be. Dogs just aren't meant to be cooped up indoors, they need to run, they need to explore, and they need a place like Nantahala. And coincidentally, so did I. Nantahala was a place I could really lose myself, a place to escape the pressures of a high-pressure, high-paying job. The woods were a place of sanctuary to me, but that all changed one chilly October day when I came to realize that there is a damned good reason why human beings have walled themselves off in towns and cities. Because the wilderness, it seems, is not our friend. Captain was always his happiest in the woods. For such a majestic animal, he has an uncanny ability to act goofy as hell, and the woods brought that out of him in spades. He'd be so lost in the feeling of pure freedom, his blue eyes all wide with his tongue lolling out of one side of his mouth, riding the wave of zoomies that inevitably had me laughing at how dorky he acted. So you can imagine how quickly I noticed a change in his behavior. How he went from being such a loud, boisterous dog to a quivering, whining wreck that barely ventured a few feet away from me at any one time. In all the time I'd been taking Captain out to Nantahala, I'd never seen him act in such a way. And when I laid a hand on his neck to give him a stroke, I discovered he was actually trembling in fear. My first thought was that a mountain lion could have been in the area, but a previous encounter with what I'd figured was a predator scent trail had caused Captain to bark incessantly and become overly aggressive. Now this was back in the fall of last year, and during the previous summer the Nantahala had seen a sharp increase in black bear activity, with homeowners being encouraged to be much more careful. Surrounding issues of food disposal. It was entirely possible that Captain had sniffed out a mama bear and cubs, in which case he was right to be cautious. But he wasn't just cautious, he was outright terrified. I had no idea what to make of such a situation, but one thing was clear, Captain wanted out. And consequently, so did I. There was only one big problem with such a plan. We'd already spent like 2 hours hiking into the woods. Getting out would not be quick or easy. With every step, the tension grew, Captain looking behind me with wild, terrified eyes, darting ahead before doubling back to whine at me. Each footstep seemed a little quicker than the last, my utter paranoia growing to fever pitch as I continually looked behind me and continually saw nothing. But something was behind us, the Captain knew it, and I could feel it. At one point, he bounded back to my side and froze, staring off into the dense forest as he sniffed at the air before him. I thought the worst was over, but I was horribly wrong. With a yelp so loud it hurt my ears, he burst off through the trees ahead, howling barks punctuating his canine gallop. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the trees behind me. And with a terror so rampant I can still feel it to this day, I heard something behind me breathing, and it was huge. I just ran, following the sound of Captain's barks, crashing through the dense trees as dry branches tore at the bare skin of my face. There are many times in my life when I've been uncomfortable, anxious, or scared. This experience dwarfed them all. No emotion can compare to that of knowing you're being hunted by something you cannot reason or bargain with, something that will crunch your bones into meal and not feel a goddamn thing. I ran harder and longer than I ever have in my life, so intensely that when I finally had to stop to draw breath, I found myself dry retching against a tree trunk, out of exhaustion, out of fear, out of pure biological imperative, making me as light and mobile as possible. But there could be no respite, Captain's furious barks made that abundantly clear. We had to keep moving. It was that or be eaten alive. With tears in my eyes, I carried on running. Hurtling through the forest, the thicket so dense I was running half blind, which was made painfully obvious when I caught my foot on a fallen tree trunk and was sent flying into the dirt. The impact knocked the wind out of me with an ugly grunt, and as I rolled onto my back, struggling for breath, I saw Captain appear at my side. He had been my hero so many times before and wasn't about to fail me now. His barks were wild, full of rage, his sharp teeth exposed as he poured the raw force of his being into the woods behind us. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring to behold, and in that moment, I thanked God that he was on my side. But not even Captain could maintain the display, for when the unseen thing hunting us seemed to roar back through the trees, Captain was silenced. He rushed over to me, taking the collar of my waterproof coat between his teeth and trying to drag me along the forest floor, but I was renewed by terror, by biological imperative, by the goddamn raw need to survive. In an instant, I was back on my feet, running, panting, scrambling for life. I remember there being a moment when I was terrified that Captain might leave me, how the fear might prove too much for him to handle. There was so much of the forest for him to escape into, but he never once failed to double back and find me. Even when he was out of sight, he made sure to continue barking furiously so I'd know exactly where to run to. That was until I burst through a set of particularly thick bushes to find Captain standing stationary at a riverbank. It wasn't all that wide, or all that deep, but it was enough of an obstacle to halt his progress. You see, Captain hated water. I don't know if it was something that happened to him as a puppy, before we adopted him from the shelter, but Captain has always hated it. Pools, rivers, lakes, you couldn't get him to go within 6 feet of any of them. Which is why seeing that river in our way terrified me on a whole new level. Out of pure instinct, I just jumped across. Like I said, it wasn't particularly wide, but the exhaustion of running for so long meant I only barely made the jump. I turned, knowing that Captain wouldn't even attempt the jump without encouragement or direction. My voice was trembling as I spoke. Come on boy, jump to mama, please boy, please, jump to mama. It was horrendous, watching his eyes so full of confusion, saying without words, why are you making me do this? I watched him pacing up and down the bank as the thing hunting us grew closer and closer. In the end, I was begging and pleading with him, promising steak dinners for an entire year if he would only get his ass across that river. For a moment, he froze, sizing up the gap before sprinting off back among the trees. Again that terrified feeling gripped me. He couldn't do it. He was so terrified of the water that in a moment of pure panic, he'd fled back in the direction of the thing chasing us. It felt like an eternity. Standing there on the riverbank, praying that he'd reappear, somehow convincing myself that he wouldn't. Only he did. In one glorious moment, he burst from the foliage, hurtling toward the river's edge at breakneck speed. As he reached the bank, his legs unfurled like springs, sending him sailing through the air, high above the river. It's funny the little details you remember from a traumatic event, and one of the things that sticks with me is Captain's eyes as he jumped that river. They were huge, these massive pale blue circles that seemed to shine out from the rings of black fur around them. Almost like he couldn't quite believe what he was going, and quite frankly, neither could I. I mean it when I say he was like an action hero in some hyperbolic 80s movie. The bravery he displayed is something I feel I can only aspire to. His landing was incredibly dramatic. He barely made it across and was scrambling up the dirt embankment when I leapt towards him, grabbed him by the collar, and pulled him up onto solid ground. When we were up, he took off again with renewed speed, seemingly more terrified of the water than of what had been stalking us. I'd had tears in my eyes before, but at that point I broke down completely, calling after him with staggered breathing, "Good boy, Captain, good B-boy." I continued to run, feeling my thighs burn and my feet ache from what felt like miles upon miles of it. I was so short of breath, so goddamn exhausted, I thought I might just pass out at any moment. When I say I could literally hear my own heart beating in my throat, I am not exaggerating in the slightest. I am not an unfit person either. I dance a lot and take spin class. I have stamina. But running at almost constant sprint for the better part of an hour made it feel like my heart was about to explode out of my chest. By the time I'd reached the peak of yet another gentle incline, my legs gave out from under me. I remember seeing silvery white patches appearing in my vision, and no matter how hard I drew breath, I just couldn't seem to get enough oxygen. When I saw something moving in front of me, something that definitely wasn't Captain, I thought that was it. I thought I'd pass out and never wake up again, having been torn apart by whatever wild animal was chasing us. I woke up in the back seat of a 4-seater pickup truck. As soon as I found the strength to sit up, I heard a voice outside the stationary vehicle shout, "She's awake." Suddenly, the door opened, and a person I'd never seen before in my life was offering me a plastic bottle of water and asking if I was okay. I didn't speak, I just took the water off of him and gulped like 3/4 of it down in one long, sweet chug. By the time I regained my senses, I was panicking. I couldn't see Captain anywhere. I looked at the stranger, dressed in his hunting gear, and tried to summon the strength to ask him where my dog was. Although the words just wouldn't come out, the look on my face must have told him all he needed to know. When he told me Captain was fine and he was just inside their hunting lodge getting a bite to eat, I just cried with relief. I was overjoyed he was okay, but that's not what made me burst into tears. The hunter told me that, for a while, Captain wouldn't follow any of them out of the truck, no matter how much meat they offered him. He just stayed at my side, yapping and whining, waiting for me to wake up. For a couple of hours, I joined the hunters in their lodge, eating the hamburger they offered me slowly while I regained my strength. I told them exactly what had happened, how Captain had freaked out after we stumbled across what I had assumed was a black bear. But black bears are relatively small, certainly not as big as grizzlies, and certainly not as big as whatever had been chasing us through the woods. I raised the issue with them and asked them what they thought it might be. I thought they might have an answer, being seasoned hunters, but they didn't. There was this awkward silence as they exchanged looks before one of them spoke up, telling they just didn't know. I asked if it was possible that a grizzly bear could make it this far down from the Rockies, with one responding that it was possible. But that was a lie, an outright lie. Those hunters quite possibly saved my life, and for that I will be eternally grateful. But I know they lied to me. Grizzlies don't make it anywhere near North Carolina at any time of the year. I've done a fair amount of research into what was chasing that day, but I've been unable to come up with anything conclusive. The only thing I know for sure is that those hunters were hiding something, and as long as they do, people will continue to go missing in that stretch of North Carolina woodland. Captain is lying next to my computer chair as I write this, ever faithful, ever watchful. And in my darkest moments, I wonder how on earth I'm going to last without him. It came from the woods. Have you ever felt a strong presence from the woods, a feeling like you are being watched? Well, the truth is something is watching you from the trees and shadows. Monsters hide in the woods, preying on the innocent and striking quickly. They won't stop, they never will. This is my story, and I hope it serves as a warning to all about the truth of the woods and how dangerous it truly is, how dangerous they are. Growing up, I never had a dad. My father left me and my mom when I was young, and I haven't seen him since. Sure, I get the occasional birthday or Christmas card with money, but besides that, he's almost a stranger to me. After my father left, my mother decided to leave the city life behind, And we moved when I was 10 to Wisconsin, where we bought a small cabin out in the woods. At first I hated living there, the woods always terrified me as a kid. Every time I looked out the window towards the woods, I always got an unsettling feeling. Chills would run up my spine, and I would start to shake uncontrollably. I always felt something was watching me, the feeling never went away even as I got older. I hated the walk to school I had to make every day, the looming feeling of getting watched grew even stronger as I walked in the woods. I felt so vulnerable looking at the tall trees. The woods I lived by had almost an endless stretch of tall trees in the forest. I felt something was watching me up on the trees. My mom, though, felt completely different about the woods. She loved them. She loved taking walks outside and just staring at the trees and the forest, taking all of nature in. She was an artist, so she loved to just sit outside and paint the trees. Many of the portraits in our cabin were of the trees and the forest. I asked her if she ever felt a presence when she was out there, like something was watching her. "Yes, I feel a strong presence, but it's a comforting one," she said. "I feel safe and protected." I never understood why she had such a comforting feeling from the woods while I felt a terrifying one that kept me wide awake almost every night. On one night when I was about to go to sleep, I saw something from the trees. It was far off into the distance, but I could barely make out the silhouette of a figure. It was big and bulky with long arms, and from the angle, it looked like it was staring right at me. I froze as I stared at it, and then I heard my mom walking to my room, and when I turned to see her open the door, I looked back to see the figure gone. I tried telling my mom, but she never listened. She said I was simply imagining things and that I needed to quit being scared of the woods. The woods protect us from the outside world, Michael. They are a shield to all the evil things in the world. I knew what I saw, and I knew whatever it was wasn't protecting me. On the way to school that morning, I felt their presence stronger than ever. Every time I turned around, though, nothing was there. Suddenly I heard a branch snap behind me, and I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't move. Then I heard another branch snap, and I took off running. I could hear fast steps behind me as I was running, which made me run faster. I could hear the footsteps gaining on me. When it seemed they were right on me, I burst out of the woods, sweating like a pig. The day went by normally. Once school was over, I asked my friend James if he wanted to walk home with me. James was my best friend and the only person who understood my fear of the woods. He lived close by to me, and he also could feel a disturbing presence watching him. He tried telling his parents like I did with mine, but they didn't listen either. "Dude, did that really happen?" he asked as I told him about what happened on the walk to school. "Yeah, man, I just don't feel comfortable walking in those woods alone, man. I know there's something in there," I said. "What do you think it is?" James asked as we started walking home. "I don't know, I think I saw it last night, though. It was enormous with huge long arms. It was far away, so I couldn't see anything else." He was quiet now, then he said, "I think I've seen it too. I saw something last night too. It was a lot like the thing you describe." Then we heard a loud snap behind us and turned around to see a tree branch on the ground snapped in half. "Dude, something's following us, we need to run," James said. "No, don't run. I did that, and it chased me. Maybe if we keep walking slowly, it won't do anything." James, looking terrified at me, nodded his head slowly as we started walking. We heard more snaps as we walked, getting louder and closer as we walked. I looked over at James, he looked back at me white as a ghost. After what felt like an hour, I could see the outline of my house in the distance. Our pace quickened as we got closer and closer to my house, the snaps and cracks quickening as well behind us. As soon as we got close enough, we took off in a dead sprint towards my house, not looking back. We ran inside, and I locked the door once we were inside. "Everything okay?" I heard my mom say behind me. We looked at each other, and then I heard James say, "Yeah, Mrs. S, we just raced each other to the house." She looked at me, and I nodded quickly. "Okay, be careful though with the door, it's old, and I don't want it falling off." "Okay, sorry, Mom," I said as James started to run off upstairs. Once upstairs and in my room, James said, "Dude, we can't walk that way to school." "I know, but what will we tell our parents?" "They won't believe us," I said. James was silent now. I knew he wouldn't be able to come up with anything. "I think as long as we're quiet and walk slow, that thing won't come after us," I said. "Yeah, let's hope so," James said in a quivering voice. James went home shortly after that, and after I ate dinner, I headed upstairs to bed. "What is that thing?" I think as I lay in bed. "A person? An animal? It's fast like an animal, but it looks like a tall person." I looked out the window into the dark forest and froze. The thing was there and closer. I could make out more characteristics as I stared at it. It had a hunchback and long fingers with razor-sharp claws. I didn't see any eyes on it, but I could somehow feel its cold stare locked on me. It just stared, observing me. Then, it turned around and walked back into the forest. That is no person or animal, I think to myself, once it's gone. It wants me, I'm its prey. After a restless night of sleep, I woke up and walked downstairs to see my mom sitting on the counter with a worried look on her face. "Hey Mom, everything okay?" I asked. "Morning, honey, I have some bad news," she said, looking at me. "What is it?" I asked. "Your friend James, well, he's missing. His parents went into his room this morning, and he was gone." I stood there petrified. It wasn't following us, it was tracking us. "Tracking James. Are you okay, Michael?" she asked. I could only see James' face in my mind now, the image of him looking at me as we were walking home, white as a ghost. I couldn't keep everything in, and I told my mom everything. The thing that chased me and James being stalked by it, and seeing it for the past 2 nights getting closer to me. "You've got to believe me, Mom," I pleaded. "Something is in those woods and it took James, and now I think it's going to take me." She looked at me with a sad expression. She sighed and then said, "I know this must be hard for you, Michael, but there's nothing in those woods. James might have run away, or anything could have happened." "Mom, it took him. James would never run away from his parents," I said. She looked at me, then looked at the clock behind me. "I think it's time you get to school now, dear, we'll talk about this later." I pleaded with my mom to drive me to school, begging her on my knees. She finally relented after a minute. Okay, just this one time. We need to leave now, though, and be quick, I have to get to the studio." I thanked her and ran to get my backpack and stuff. Nothing happened on the drive as I expected. After dropping me off at the front of the school, everyone ran up to me and asked if I had heard about what happened to James. Everyone was talking about James that day. They started rumors either saying he ran away or was kidnapped. "Do you know what happened to him?" Sally asked frantically as she ran up to me at lunch. She had had a crush on James since the 2nd grade, and even though James showed no signs of affection towards her, she still adored him. She was a short girl, with short brown hair and brown eyes. I debated about whether I should tell Sally the truth, but I knew she wouldn't believe me. No one would. I told her I didn't know and tried to continue eating my lunch, but she wouldn't give up. "Come on Michael, you're his best friend, please, if you know anything that could have happened to him, please tell me," she said with tears in her eyes. I tried ignoring her, but she wouldn't stop, and then her friends came over and started asking, and then more and more people came asking if I knew what happened to James. The voices became too much for me, and I screamed. "I don't know what happened to him, please leave me alone." I screamed as loud as I could. Everyone stopped talking and now stared at me. My cheeks started to turn red as I got embarrassed. The bell rang, and everyone started heading off to class, leaving me still sitting at the lunch table. I packed my unfinished lunch and started to head off to my science class, which I had next. I decided then and there that I would find James. I had to know if he was alive or not. "James, if you're still alive, I'll find you." After school I called my mom and asked if she could pick me up. She said she could, and 5 minutes later she pulled up in her white Cadillac. As we drove home, she asked, "Feeling better, honey?" I lied, saying, "Much better." I knew she would never believe me. I was going to have to face that thing on my own. We got home, and I headed straight upstairs, where I dumped all my school supplies on my bed and started to pack gear for that night. I packed spare flashlight batteries, some water, and I put the pepper spray my mom gave to me last year in my pocket just in case. As I was eating dinner, I came up with a plan. I would sneak out of the house when my mom went to bed, which was usually around 10, and I would head into the woods and try to find him. I knew my chances against that thing were slim to none, so I knew I would have to be quiet and careful. After dinner, I went to my room and waited. I waited for hours until I looked over at my clock, which read 10:30 p.m. I hopped out of bed and walked over to the window, opening it quietly. I made a little rope with my bed sheets as I waited, as I knew I wouldn't be able to jump off the window without getting hurt. I tied the rope against my bed and started to climb out of the house slowly. Once down, I turned my flashlight on and aimed it towards the woods. It was even more terrifying now. The trees seemed endless, and I couldn't even see the moon. I took a deep breath and started to walk slowly into the woods. I noticed something that started to scare me quickly once I was walking. There was absolute silence. Not a peep, no crickets, no owls, nothing. I flashed my light around quickly, calling out James' name quietly. James, James, are you out there? Nothing but silence echoes in the woods. I walk towards the direction of James's house, thinking he may be around there. As I'm about halfway to his house, the battery for my flashlight dies. Darkness now engulfs me as I panic. I scramble for the batteries in my backpack. Once I find them, I take the dead batteries out of my flashlight and put the new ones in. When I turned my light back on, I screamed. Standing in front of me was that thing. The fear I felt was indescribable. Even to this day, the image of it still fills my dreams with nightmares. It had no skin, it was all red muscles and tissues. It had no eyes, and its mouth was full of dozens of razor-sharp teeth as it smiled and drooled, looking down at me. It was at least 9 feet tall, and it had a bad hunch to its back. Its claws were even sharper close up, as sharp as its teeth were. Its upper body was big and bulky while its long legs were skinny as a twig. Its arms were huge with big muscles and bulging veins. I screamed even more as it bent down and picked me up by the head. It dragged me across the woods as I kicked and screamed, "Stupid, stupid, stupid, stupid. What the hell were you thinking coming into the woods?" I thought. It dragged me until I eventually passed out. When I woke, I found myself in a dark cave, hanging upside down by at least 5 feet. The cave looked ancient, with 3 tunnels that led into darkness. I had never seen this cave in the woods, never even knew there was one in the first place. The light that was in the cave was from a single fire in the middle of the cave. I could see my backpack on the ground with my phone near it. I tried to reach and grab it, but I couldn't move. The thing had wrapped ropes around my ankles to the sharp rocks above me. I was hopeless. I thought of James now as I started to look around the cave. In one of the corners of the cave, I saw a single orange t-shirt on the ground. That's James's shirt, I realized. Suddenly I heard heavy footsteps walking towards me. I saw the thing walk into the cave as it stared at me. I panicked and started screaming again. Then the thing spoke in a dark and gruff voice. "Quiet food, maybe I'll let you live a little longer." I shut up now, petrified as it spoke to me. I saw in its hand a leg. Oh God, please let that not be James, I thought. It spoke again now. "I've been watching you for a long time. You have always looked the most appetizing of everyone." It lifted up the leg in its hand and then said, "Your friend here tasted wonderful, but I think you'll taste even better," it said with a twisted grin on its face. I started to cry, weeping at the loss of my friend and knowing that I would follow in his footsteps. Somehow, I got out a question in a shaky voice. "What are you?" The thing looked down at me for a moment, thinking, then said, "I am an ancient being. My kind is almost extinct, as there are only a few of us left. We have ruled the woods for the past centuries, preying on anything that steps foot on any of our lands. Over time, hunters have come and killed most of my kind. Now we hide in the shadows, only coming out when food is near." I think for a moment before asking another question. "Do you only eat young kids?" The thing now smiled, showing off its dozen of teeth as it said. "Of course, kids taste the best, very juicy and sweet." It had cut me off the ropes with its claws, squeezing me with its ginormous hands as it started to open its mouth. I was barely able to ask one more question. "How can you hunt without any eyes?" It stared at me, closing its mouth before saying, "I can track your scent. My nose serves as my eyes, as I have none. I smell my food out before I come for it at night. Lucky for me, I didn't have to come for you. You came to me." It opened its mouth wide as I panicked, starting to throw myself around, trying to get out of its grasp. "Hold still, food." It boomed at me. I was somehow able to move my hands into my pocket, where miraculously I felt the pepper spray that didn't fall out of my pocket. I acted quickly as I got closer to the thing's mouth and pulled out the pepper spray and sprayed it into its face. It shrieked as it dropped me, crying and holding its face. I got up quickly and ran towards the middle entrance where the creature came from. I ran as fast as I could, hearing the creature give chase behind me. I ran until I somehow found the entrance to the cave. I saw light illuminating from the entrance as I ran with all my might into the day. I kept running even after I was out of the cave. I ran and never looked back. I was able to somehow navigate my way through the forest to the cabin. I gave a sigh of relief once I saw the cabin and stopped running. I looked behind me now, expecting the thing to be right behind me, ready to strike. Nothing was there. I walked back to the cabin, out of breath. When I opened the door, my mom ran towards me, embracing me as she cried. "Where have you been?" "I called the police, and they couldn't find you. I thought I lost you." I didn't say anything. I was tired and hungry, but worse of all, I was terrified knowing that more of those things were out there, waiting for me. We moved shortly after that to Chicago and moved in with my aunt. I grew up normally and made new friends in Chicago. I even got a new best friend named Kyle. I never forgot about James, though. He was my first best friend who had my back and died in the hands of a monster. The thought of that thing still haunts me now. I tried telling my mom what happened many times, but I couldn't. I knew she still wouldn't believe me. What scares me the most is knowing there are still more of those things out there, hunting in the shadows. I write this story to tell everyone, to warn everyone about these things. They hunt for children, feasting on them. Be careful near the woods, you never know what lurks in the shadows of the trees. Please, don't ever go into the woods at night, they are watching and waiting for you.